A temporal displacement paradox occurs when a time traveler becomes the catalyst for the very events that eventually lead them to travel through time. In this extraordinary circumstance, causality forms a perfect circle. The future influences the past, which creates the future with no discernible beginning or end to the sequence. This closed causal loop challenges our fundamental understanding of cause and effect, suggesting that some events might exist without a true point of origin. Imagine drifting through the possibilities of time travel as we explore these mind-bending scenarios together. I'd like to invite you to share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's fascinating to think about how we're all connected through these stories and theories, despite being separated by time zones and distances. If you enjoy these contemplative journeys into the nature of reality, consider subscribing to Chronos Whispers so we can continue bringing you these immersive explorations of time's greatest mysteries. Now, settle back, find a comfortable position, and allow your mind to wander freely as we venture into the labyrinth of temporal paradoxes that have fascinated philosophers, scientists, and dreamers throughout human history. The concept of time travel has captivated human imagination since ancient myths spoke of gods who could move freely between past and future. Today, theoretical physics suggests that while physically challenging, time travel might not be impossible according to Einstein's equations. But the most intriguing aspects aren't the mechanics of how we might someday traverse time. They're the philosophical puzzles that emerge when we contemplate the consequences. Consider the journey of Dr. Alexandra Mercer, a brilliant quantum physicist who discovers an unusual pattern in the fabric of space-time. Her calculations reveal a method to create temporary bridges between different temporal points, not stable enough for physical travel, but sufficient to transmit information. After years of refining her technique, she succeeds in sending a message to herself 5 years in the past. The message contains a specific sequence of quantum fluctuations that her younger self would recognize as significant. When young Alexandra receives this pattern, she's stunned. It's an elegant solution to the very problem she's been struggling with. This breakthrough accelerates her research by years, eventually leading her to develop the very technology she used to send the message back in the first place. But here lies the paradox. Where did the information originally come from? Alexandra only discovered the quantum pattern because she received it from her future self, who only knew it because she received it from her future self, and so on, in an infinite regression. The knowledge exists in a perfect loop, with no point of creation. It was never truly discovered in a traditional sense. This temporal displacement paradox challenges our linear understanding of information and discovery. In conventional science, knowledge builds upon previous discoveries in a clear sequence. Einstein's theories expanded on Newton's work, which grew from earlier scientific understanding. But in Alexandra's case, the information simply exists, caught in a self-sustaining cycle without beginning or end. Some theoretical physicists propose that such paradoxes might be resolved through quantum mechanics, suggesting that information might sometimes exist in superposition, simultaneously created and received across different points in time. Others argue that true temporal displacement paradoxes are impossible, and that nature would prevent such loops from forming through as yet undiscovered physical laws. What makes these paradoxes particularly fascinating is how they force us to question assumptions about reality that we typically take for granted. Does every effect need a cause? Must information always have an origin? If time is not the straight arrow we perceive it to be, what does that mean for concepts like free will and determinism? As you contemplate these questions, imagine the implications for your own life. Every choice you make, every piece of knowledge you acquire, every relationship you form. In a conventional understanding, these all have clear origins and sequences. But what if some elements of your experience exist in more complex patterns of causality? Perhaps that sudden inspiration, that dream solution to a problem you'd been struggling with, or that inexplicable sense of familiarity with something you've never encountered before. Could these be echoes of more complex temporal interactions than our everyday understanding allows? The temporal displacement paradox invites us to expand our conception of reality beyond the familiar boundaries of linear time. It suggests a universe where past, present, and future might be more intimately connected than we typically perceive, where causality might sometimes flow, not just forward, but in cycles that transcend our conventional understanding of beginnings and endings. As we drift deeper into these possibilities, remember that paradoxes aren't merely puzzles to be solved, they're windows into the limitations of our current understanding, inviting us to imagine beyond what we know into the vast expanse of what might be possible. In the quiet moments between wakefulness and sleep, consider how the act of observation itself might change the nature of time. The observer effect. Paradox occurs when a time traveler's presence in the past alters events not through direct action, but merely through the act of witnessing. Unlike more dramatic paradoxes where travelers actively change history, this subtle interaction raises unsettling questions about whether any observation can truly be passive. When we observe a quantum particle, we unavoidably change its behavior. What if time itself responds similarly to observation from outside its natural flow? The very presence of an observer from another time might create ripples in the fabric of history, imperceptible changes that cascade through causality in ways the traveler never intended. Dr. Elijah Kaplan developed what he believed was the perfect solution to the dangers of time travel, the temporal observer protocol. His innovation wasn't a physical transportation device, but rather a consciousness projection system. A person could project their awareness to any point in history, while their physical body remained safely in the present. The observer could see and hear events unfold, but could not physically interact with the past. No touching objects, no speaking to historical figures, no direct interference of any kind. Perfect non-interference, Kaplan called it in his journals. We become ghosts in time, learning without disturbing. The Temporal Historical Society eagerly adopted Kaplan's protocol, sending trained observers to witness pivotal moments in history. For years, the program operated without incident. Observers reported their findings, enhancing historical records with first-hand accounts, while seemingly avoiding the paradoxes that physical time travel would create, until Dr. Mei Chen made a troubling discovery while reviewing observation logs from multiple temporal sessions. Dr. Chen noticed subtle patterns emerging across different observations of the same historical events. When the Wright brothers achieved their first flight at Kitty Hawk. Observation logs showed variations in exactly when Orville Wright lifted off, differences of several seconds. In records of Galileo's famous demonstration at the Leaning Tower of Pisa, the objects he dropped sometimes hit the ground simultaneously, sometimes with slight delays between them. Most historians dismiss these inconsistencies as simple errors in perception or recording, but Chen recognized something more significant. The variations correlated with the number of temporal observers present. Events observed by more witnesses showed greater deviation from their expected outcomes. Chen proposed a radical theory. Consciousness itself carries temporal weight. When minds from different points in time observe a single moment, they create a kind of observational pressure that subtly warps the fabric of reality. The more observers, the greater the distortion. To test her theory, Chen arranged an unprecedented experiment. 50 observers would project to a single, historically insignificant moment, the ringing of a specific church bell in an Italian village in 1742. The event was chosen for its isolation and minimal historical impact. The bell had rung at precisely noon for hundreds of years, documented in meticulous town records. The observers projected to positions around the village square. They watched, invisible to the locals, as the bell ringer climbed the tower. They observed silently as he reached for the rope. And then, unexpectedly, he hesitated, looking around as if sensing something unusual. When he finally pulled the rope, the town clock showed 12:07, 7 minutes late, far beyond any reasonable margin of error. Chen's experiment was repeated with varying numbers of observers. The results formed a clear pattern. The more observers present, the greater the temporal distortion. With just one observer, the bell rang within seconds of noon. With 100, it sometimes didn't ring at all, as if the bell ringer became too disoriented by the invisible temporal pressure surrounding him. The implications were profound. Every moment in history that had been observed through Kaplan's protocol had potentially been altered by the very act of observation. Historical records weren't being enhanced. They were being subtly rewritten. Most disturbing was the realization that famous moments in history would naturally attract more temporal observers. Presidential assassinations, revolutionary declarations, pivotal scientific discoveries. These world-changing events would draw the greatest number of observers and therefore experience the most significant distortions. Had history, as we knew it, been shaped by future observation? Had key moments in human development been nudged in different directions by the invisible weight of watching minds? The events that seemed most important to observe were precisely those most vulnerable to being changed by observation. The Temporal Historical Society immediately suspended their program, but the damage was impossible to assess. How could they know what history would have been without their interference? The baseline they would need for comparison had been irreversibly altered. Dr. Kaplan withdrew from public life, devastated that his perfect non-interference protocol had created perhaps the most pervasive form of interference imaginable. In his final paper, never published, but found among his personal effects after his death, he wrote, "We believed ourselves to be ghosts in time, but we were more like gravity, invisible yet irresistibly influential. Every moment we observed bent toward our attention." This paradox challenges our most basic assumptions about causality and free will. If the mere knowledge that an event will be significant enough to observe from the future can alter how that event unfolds, then perhaps history has always existed in conversation with its future observers. Perhaps what we call history is actually the result of a complex temporal resonance between events and those who would later study them. Consider the strange symmetry in how pivotal moments in history often seem to unfold with an awareness of their own significance. Leaders deliver perfectly crafted statements that will be quoted for generations. Scientists describe their discoveries with elegant phrases that capture the imagination. Witnesses to tragedy find words that somehow convey the full emotional weight of what they've seen. What if these aren't coincidences, but evidence of temporal observation pressure? What if history performs for its future audience in subtle ways we've never recognized? The observer effect. Paradox suggests that time might not be a simple progression from past to future, but rather a responsive medium that reacts to attention from across its breadth. Like quantum particles that behave differently when measured, perhaps reality itself shifts under the weight of consciousness, moving against its natural flow. For those who contemplate time travel, this paradox presents a sobering reality. There may be no such thing as passive observation. The desire to witness without interfering may be fundamentally impossible. The very act of directing attention across time may inevitably shape what is seen. As you drift toward sleep, consider the moments in your own life when you felt strangely aware of being at a turning point. Those times when something seemed to whisper, "Remember this." Could such moments be responded not just to your present awareness, but to some future attention directed back toward this very instant? Perhaps time is always watching itself through the distributed consciousness of all who exist within its flow. If memories shape who we are, what happens when those memories come from events that no longer exist? The memory paradox emerges when a time traveler retains awareness of an erased timeline, remembering experiences, relationships, and knowledge from a version of reality that technically never happened. This contradiction creates a profound dilemma. Are memories real if they refer to events that never occurred? Dr. Sofia Novak didn't set out to erase history. Her research into quantum neurological mapping began as a search for better treatments for Alzheimer's disease. By creating a method to externally store and retrieve memories, she hoped to help patients maintain their sense of self even as their brains deteriorated. But her breakthrough led somewhere unexpected. She discovered that memories exist partially outside conventional space-time, connected to the mind through quantum entanglement, rather than being physically encoded in neural pathways alone. This discovery led to her development of the temporal memory anchor, a device capable of preserving memory states across timeline alterations. Novak saw it as a safeguard for potential time travelers, ensuring they wouldn't lose themselves if changes to the past affected their personal histories. The first human test subject was Marcus Webb, a researcher on Novak's team who had lost his wife Elena to a rare genetic disorder 5 years earlier. The test was straightforward. Webb would travel back and prevent himself from meeting Elena. If successful, he would retain memories of their relationship, even though, in the new timeline, it never happened. Preparing and narrating this theory took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the theory. The experiment worked perfectly to perfectly. Webb returned to a present where he had never met Elena, where she had married someone else and was still alive. His colleagues had no memory of her working at their facility. His apartment contained no photos of their life together. According to all external evidence, they had never fallen in love, never shared a home, never faced her illness together. But Webb remembered everything, every conversation, every anniversary, every doctor's appointment, every moment of grief after her passing. His mind contained a complete record of a relationship that, to the rest of the world, had never existed. At first, Webb considered this a success, proof that the temporal memory anchor worked as designed. But as days passed, the psychological weight became unbearable. He found himself grieving a woman who hadn't died, missing a relationship no one else remembered, referencing shared experiences that his friends insisted never happened. "Am I mourning a person or a timeline?" he wrote in his journal. "If Elena is alive and happy, what right do I have to feel this loss? Yet the Elena I loved exists only in my memories now, memories of something that never happened." Webb's experience raised profound questions about the nature of reality and personal identity. If memories from an erased timeline persist, which version is more real? The world as it exists now, or the world as remembered by the traveler? If a time traveler is shaped by experiences that never technically happened, are they still the same person? Dr. Novak expanded her research to understand these questions, working with Webb and eventually other time travelers who carried memories of erased timelines. Her findings revealed something unexpected. Memory paradoxes created unique neurological patterns that differed from both normal memories and false memories. When someone recalls events that actually happened, specific neural networks activate in predictable patterns. False memories or imagined scenarios create distinctly different patterns, but memories from erased timelines showed a third pattern entirely, one that contained quantum signatures suggesting connection to something that had existed but no longer did. "These aren't false memories," Novak explained in her landmark paper. "They're echoes of genuine experiences that occurred in timelines that have been overwritten. The memories themselves are the last remaining evidence that these events ever happened at all." The implications extended beyond individual travelers. If changing the past erases a timeline but not the memories of it, what happens to the consciousness that experienced that timeline? Where does that lived experience reside, if not in the physical world? Some theorists propose that erased timelines continue to exist in a quantum state, accessible only through the memories of those who experience them. Others suggested that time travelers create a form of temporal diaspora, consciousnesses scattered across different versions of reality, connected only by thin threads of memory. For Webb, the philosophical questions eventually gave way to a more immediate concern: how to live with memories of a relationship only he remembered. He tried visiting Elena in the new timeline, but found her to be simultaneously familiar and a stranger, the same person physically, but without the shared experiences that had shaped their relationship. "She looks at me without recognition," he noted, "and I look at her with too much. We are permanently out of sync." Other time travelers reported similar experiences. Dr. Victor Ramos remembered raising a daughter who, in the new timeline, was never born. Commander Sarah Lynn recalled a 5-year mission to Mars, that current history recorded as having failed during launch. Professor Thomas Baker remembered writing books that no longer existed. Each traveler faced the same question: what is the value of memory when it no longer connects to shared reality? Is experience real if no one else remembers it? Some travelers found ways to adapt. Dr. Ramos created art based on his memories, transforming personal history into fiction. Commander Lin used her knowledge from the erased mission to improve current space exploration programs. Professor Baker rewrote the books he remembered, often finding they were better the second time. But others struggled with a unique form of isolation. Webb eventually joined a support group for time travelers with memory paradoxes, people who remembered lives, relationships, achievements, and tragedies that had been erased from history. They alone carried the last traces of entire branches of reality that no longer existed. "We are living archives," one member said. "When we die, entire timelines die with us." The memory paradox forces us to reconsider what we mean by reality. If reality is only what currently exists in the physical world, then memories of erased timelines are mere illusions. But if consciousness and experience have their own validity independent of physical reality, then perhaps these memories represent something just as real as the current timeline. Traces of paths not taken, lives not lived, but nonetheless experienced. It raises questions about our own memories as well. How do we know our memories align with consensus reality? If they diverged, would we even notice? Perhaps we all live with minor memory paradoxes, recalling events slightly differently than they occurred, or remembering moments no one else does. As you drift closer to sleep, consider your own most precious memories, the connections that define you, the experiences that shaped your identity. What would remain of who you are if those memories belonged to a timeline that no longer existed? And would they be any less meaningful, any less real to you if you were the only one who remembered them? Among all temporal conundrums, perhaps none is more infamous than the grandfather paradox, the scenario where a time traveler journeys to the past and prevents their own existence. If they succeed in eliminating a necessary condition for their birth, how could they have existed to travel back in time in the first place? Consider Jackson Reed, a quantum physicist who built the world's first functional time displacement device. Unlike his colleagues who pursued grand scientific observations or historical documentation, Reed harbored a darker purpose. His mother had died when he was young, killed by his grandfather, a man Reed never met but grew to despise through family stories of abuse and violence. Reed calculated the exact date and location to intercept his grandfather decades before his mother's birth. He arrived in a small town in 1937, tracking his grandfather to a local tavern. Reed watched from across the room, hand resting on the pistol concealed beneath his coat. The young man drinking at the bar looked nothing like the monster from family photographs, just an ordinary person, laughing with friends, unaware of the suffering he would someday cause. As Reed approached, his hand began to tremble, not from moral hesitation, but from a strange physical sensation. His fingers appeared translucent in the dim light, occasionally seeming to fade from view entirely. When he tried to grasp the weapon, his hand passed through it as though it were smoke. With mounting horror, Reed realized he was becoming untethered from physical reality. Theoretical physicists had speculated about this possibility. that the universe itself might prevent paradoxes through quantum instability. As Reid moved closer to an action that would negate his own existence, his connection to reality weakened proportionally. The closer he came to creating the paradox, the less substantial he became. Reid stumbled from the tavern, his grandfather still alive, still destined to father Reid's mother and later destroy her life. Outside in the cold air, Reid's form stabilized somewhat. A hypothesis formed in his mind. Perhaps the degree of physical manifestation corresponded directly to the probability of his existence. By simply intending to kill his grandfather, he had already reduced that probability significantly. Over subsequent days, Reid tested this theory with increasing desperation. He arranged accidents that his grandfather somehow always narrowly avoided. He attempted to intercept letters that mysteriously rerouted themselves. Each failure stabilized Reid's existence temporarily, but each new attempt made his physical coherence deteriorate further. On his final attempt, Reid positioned himself on a bridge his grandfather crossed daily. As the young man approached, Reid prepared to push him into the river below. But at the crucial moment, Reid's arms passed harmlessly through his grandfather's form. More disturbing still, his grandfather walked directly through Reid as though he weren't there at all, not even registering the cold spot that ghosts supposedly create. In that moment, Reid understood the universe's defense mechanism against paradox. He hadn't become a ghost in the past. He had become a ghost to the past. The timeline had quarantined him in a state of quantum superposition, neither fully present nor absent, incapable of creating the paradox that would unravel causality. Reid returned to his own time, forever changed by the experience. His research notes describe what he called causality's immune system, the universe's apparent ability to create quantum barriers around potential paradoxes. His work suggested that time was not a fragile structure easily broken by contradiction, but rather a resilient system with built-in safeguards. Other researchers expanded on Reid's discoveries. Dr. Hannah Okafor found that the causal immune response was proportional to the paradox's potential impact. Minor changes that wouldn't significantly alter the traveler's existence encountered minimal resistance, while direct existential threats, like the grandfather paradox, triggered maximum protection responses. This revelation transformed temporal physics. Time travel didn't need to be restricted for fear of catastrophic paradoxes. The universe itself had evolved mechanisms to prevent them. However, these protections applied only to changes that would create logical impossibilities. Moral consequences remained entirely unaddressed. The most unsettling aspect of Reid's experience wasn't the universe's protection mechanisms, but what they implied about free will. If causality protects itself, are time travelers merely observers of fixed events? Does temporal physics reduce human agency to an illusion when confronted with the immutable architecture of space-time? Some philosophers argued that these constraints actually proved free will's existence, that the universe only intervenes when choice threatens logical consistency, leaving infinite possibilities that don't create paradoxes still accessible. Others saw it as confirmation of determinism, evidence that all events exist in a predetermined block of space-time where past, present, and future are already set. As you contemplate these possibilities, consider how causality shapes your own existence. Every choice you've ever made and every circumstance of your birth exists within an intricate web of cause and effect stretching back to the beginning of time. How many chance encounters, narrow escapes, and seemingly random events were necessary for you to exist exactly as you are in this moment? The bootstrap paradox presents a particularly perplexing problem in temporal physics. An object or information that exists without ever having been created. Like a person pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps, the paradox describes something that lifts itself into existence through a closed, time-like curve, with no discernible point of origin. Isabella Reyes was a struggling composer in 2042, working nights at a quantum computing lab to pay bills while pursuing her true passion during the day. While calibrating the lab's experimental temporal scanner, designed to observe but not interact with the past, she discovered an unusual anomaly that allowed sound to travel back through the observation window. Initially considered a system error, Reyes recognized its potential. During one late shift, frustrated after another rejected composition, she impulsively transmitted the melody haunting her thoughts through the temporal scanner. The scanner was calibrated to 1887 Vienna, where she had been observing musical performances as a personal indulgence during system tests. 6 months later, while listening to a recently discovered historical recording, Reyes froze in shock. The piece being performed was unmistakably hers, the very melody she had transmitted. According to the recording's documentation, it was composed by an obscure Austrian composer who claimed divine inspiration for the work after hearing it from the air itself, while alone in his study. Reyes immediately accessed historical archives, discovering that the composition had influenced generations of musicians, eventually becoming part of the musical education she herself had received. The melody she had created was, in fact, inspired by classical techniques she had studied, techniques evolved from the very composition she had transmitted to the past. "I wrote it because I heard it," she noted in her journal, "and it exists in history because I sent it back. But where did it actually come from?" The composition had no point of origin. Reyes hadn't truly created it. She had reproduced something she'd learned, which only existed in the first place because she sent it back in time. The melody was caught in a perfect causal loop, bootstrap lifting itself into existence. When Reyes brought her discovery to Dr. Mikhail Volkov, the lab's theoretical physicist, he was less surprised than she expected. Information paradoxes have been theoretically predicted since the early days of temporal physics, he explained. What you've encountered is a self-existing information loop, something that has no point of original creation. Volkov cautioned Reyes against further experiments, warning of potentially greater destabilization of causal structures. But curiosity proved stronger than caution. Reyes began intentionally sending musical fragments to different time periods, creating a constellation of bootstrap paradoxes throughout music history. A chord progression transmitted to 1964 London appeared in songs that had influenced her childhood musical tastes. A rhythmic pattern sent to 1723 Leipzig emerged in compositions she had studied extensively. With each transmission, Reyes found herself increasingly entangled in loops of causality. Her own musical development had been shaped by the very compositions she was now responsible for inserting into history. She wasn't creating music. She was completing circles that already included her. The philosophical implications disturbed her more than the physics. If these musical ideas had no true point of origin, were they actually human creations? Or were they more like mathematical truths, things discovered rather than invented, existing independently of human minds? Professor Eliza Chen, a philosopher of science consulting with the lab, proposed that bootstrap paradoxes revealed something fundamental about information itself. Perhaps certain ideas exist in Platonic space, outside normal causality, she suggested. Time travel merely reveals that some concepts don't require conventional creation. Others disagreed. Dr. Samuel Okonkwo, a quantum information theorist, argued that bootstrap paradoxes represented degradation in universal entropy. Each loop should introduce quantum copying errors, he contended. The fact that we don't observe these errors suggests there are deeper principles at work preventing true information paradoxes. The debate expanded beyond music. Researchers identified potential bootstrap paradoxes in historical scientific discoveries, literary works, and even technological innovations. Some temporal physicists suggested that human culture might be riddled with self-causing information loops, undetectable until the development of temporal observation technology revealed their impossible origins. Reyes eventually stopped her transmissions, troubled by the implications. Her journal entries reflect growing existential concerns. If my music isn't truly mine, if I'm merely a conduit in a circular flow of information that has always existed, then what does that mean for human creativity? Are we creators or simply mediators for ideas that exist independently of time itself? The bootstrap paradox leaves us with unsettling questions about originality and creation. If something exists without ever having been truly created, merely passing endlessly through a temporal loop, does it still qualify as a human achievement? Does authorship have meaning when causality circles back on itself? As your consciousness drifts toward the edges of sleep, consider the ideas that seem to arrive fully formed in your mind. The sudden inspirations, the dreams that feel significant, the solutions that appear when you weren't actively seeking them. Could some of these be fragments caught in loops of time, whispering to us from nowhere and everywhere at once? When a time traveler changes the past, what happens to the original timeline? Does it continue to exist alongside the new one, or does it vanish entirely? The multiverse paradox emerges from this question, suggesting that every temporal intervention creates not an altered timeline, but an entirely new branch of reality that exists parallel to the original. Dr. Julian Faris never intended to prove the multiverse theory. His temporal displacement experiments at Kronos Labs focused on sending simple objects, a watch, a thermometer, a radiation detector, into the past to measure if physical constants remained stable across time. But everything changed when the facility's quantum servers detected an anomaly, data transmissions arriving from a future that their models predicted couldn't exist. The messages were undeniably from Kronos Labs, signed with encryption keys only their team possessed, but they described events that contradicted their current reality, referencing staff members who'd never been hired, experiments they'd never conducted, and theoretical breakthroughs they hadn't yet made. Most disturbing were the warnings about an accident that would supposedly destroy the lab 3 days later. The messages included detailed safety protocols to prevent the catastrophe, specifying an overload in a system that, in their timeline hadn't even been built yet. After verifying the authenticity of the transmissions, Ferris made the critical decision to implement the safety measures. The predicted day came and went without incident. The team celebrated avoiding disaster, but their relief was short-lived as they confronted a troubling question. If they had prevented the accident, how could they have received warnings about it? The answer came from Dr. Layla Kapoor, the team's quantum physicist. "We didn't alter our timeline," she explained. "We created a new one. The warnings came from a parallel reality where the accident happened. By acting on that information, we branched into a different path, one where the accident never occurs." This insight led to Kapoor's revolutionary branching timeline theory. According to her model, time travel doesn't change the original timeline, but instead creates a divergent reality at the moment of intervention. The original timeline continues unaltered, while a new branch forms where the intervention and its consequences exist. To test this theory, the team designed an experiment of elegant simplicity. They would send a signal to their past selves with instructions to place a red paperweight on Ferris's desk at exactly 3 p.m. the following day. If their timeline was being altered, the paperweight would simply appear at the specified time as the past changed. If multiple timelines were being created, nothing would happen in their current reality. At 3 p.m., Ferris's desk remained empty. No paperweight appeared. But their temporal receivers detected a new signal, a confirmation from a parallel Chronos labs that they had received the message and placed the paperweight as instructed. This version of the lab now existed in a separate branch of reality, one that had diverged from the original timeline at the moment they received the message. "We aren't changing our past," Ferris noted in his journal. "We're budding off new universes with each intervention, universes that share our history up to the point of divergence, then follow a different path." The implications were staggering. Every time travel event spawned a new universe. The original timeline wasn't erased. It continued alongside the new branch. This explained why paradoxes like the grandfather paradox didn't unravel reality. Killing your grandfather in the past wouldn't erase your existence in your original timeline, but would create a new reality where you were never born. This revelation transformed temporal physics. Researchers realized they weren't altering history, but navigating between parallel versions of it. Time travel wasn't about changing the past, but about creating and accessing different branches of the multiverse. The ethical questions this raised were profound. If sending a warning to the past created a new timeline where a disaster was averted, did that truly count as saving lives? The disaster would still occur in the original timeline. The message would merely spawn a reality where different people survived. Are we creating better worlds, or just abandoning the troubled ones? Kapoor asked in a lecture that divided the scientific community. If I warn my past self about a plane crash and she takes a different flight, I've created a timeline where she survives. But in my original timeline, that version of me still boards the doomed plane. Does her survival matter if another version still perishes? Some physicists found comfort in the multiverse model. It meant that every possible choice and event happened somewhere across the branching realities. Nothing was truly lost. It all existed in some version of the multiverse. Others found it existentially troubling. If infinite variations of every person existed across countless timelines, did individual choices lose meaning? If everything that could happen did happen in some reality, did free will still matter? For time travelers, the multiverse model created a particular loneliness. No matter how they changed the past, they could never return to their original reality, but would always arrive in a newly created branch. They became permanent immigrants, forever separated from their original homes by walls of quantum probability. As you drift towards sleep, consider the possibility that countless versions of yourself exist across an infinite tapestry of realities. In some, you made different choices. In others, chance took different turns, each timeline complete and real to those experiencing it, each one a road not taken in all the others. What if the smallest action in the past could dramatically reshape the future? The butterfly effect paradox explores how minute changes can cascade into unimaginable consequences across time. Unlike paradoxes that create logical contradictions, this one reveals the fragile interconnectedness of events and the practical impossibility of controlled time manipulation. Dr. Abigail Turner specialized in climate modeling, using advanced algorithms to predict how small atmospheric changes influence global weather patterns. Her work at the Palmer Climate Institute demonstrated how a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil could theoretically trigger a tornado in Texas weeks later. These were not mere theoretical abstractions for Turner, but mathematical certainties that showed the profound sensitivity of complex systems. When the Temporal Research Division approached her to model historical climate data, Turner didn't realize she was entering the classified world of time travel research. Her assignment seemed straightforward: analyze atmospheric data collected from temporal observation posts throughout history to improve their climate models. The project changed when Turner noticed anomalies in the historical data, subtle atmospheric disturbances that coincided with temporal observation missions. Initially dismissed as measurement errors, Turner eventually proved these disturbances were caused by the observation devices themselves. Simply by placing sensors in the past, they were altering the very atmospheric conditions they intended to measure. Even our most passive observation creates change, Turner reported. The displacement of air molecules when our devices materialize, the minimal heat they generate, the tiny gravitational influence they exert, all create ripples that compound over time. Her mathematical models showed that a temporal observer device placed in 1850 London for 1 hour would create sufficient atmospheric disturbance to potentially alter weather patterns across Europe within weeks. Extended further through her simulation models, these changes could influence crop yields, migration patterns, disease spread, and ultimately the course of human events. Director Helena Chen of the Temporal Research Division initially classified Turner's findings. If merely observing the past changes it, imagine what intentional intervention might do, Chen noted in a sealed committee hearing. We're not talking about altering who wins a war. We're talking about whether the conditions for that war would even arise. Against institutional resistance, Turner developed the butterfly mapping protocol, a predictive model for temporal intervention consequences. To demonstrate its accuracy, she convinced the division to conduct a controlled experiment. A single grain of sand would be moved 1 centimeter on an uninhabited beach in 1905 Australia. Her model predicted specific weather pattern changes in the South Pacific 3 weeks after the intervention. When these changes occurred exactly as forecast, even skeptics were convinced. Turner's subsequent simulations revealed how this minor weather alteration would influence shipping routes, slightly delaying a freighter carrying machine parts to San Francisco. The cascading effects became increasingly profound. The delayed shipment meant a factory received components late, postponing the production of mining equipment bound for silver mines in Nevada. This reduced silver extraction during a specific month in 1906, slightly decreasing the available currency minted that quarter. The economic effects rippled through countless transactions, subtly altering business decisions, personal purchases, and investment patterns. By 1929, Turner's model showed a significantly different economic landscape than recorded history, enough to potentially prevent or worsen the Great Depression. By 1945, the timeline diverged so dramatically that familiar historical events became unrecognizable. World War II might never happen in that altered timeline, or might manifest in more devastating forms. "We've been conceptualizing time travel all wrong," Turner explained in her classified presentation. "We imagine changing a significant event, saving Kennedy, killing Hitler, but those obvious interventions might be corrected by the natural momentum of history. It's the insignificant changes, too small to counterbalance, that create the most profound divergences over time." The Temporal Research Division immediately implemented strict non-interference protocols based on Turner's work. Observation became permissible only with comprehensive butterfly mapping to minimize disturbance. Direct intervention was prohibited entirely, the risks of unintended consequences deemed too severe. Some researchers proposed using the butterfly effect deliberately, making precisely calculated small changes to nudge history in desired directions. Turner vehemently opposed this approach, demonstrating that even with their most advanced quantum computing, no model could reliably predict beyond a few months after intervention. The variables became too numerous, the potential branches too diverse. The butterfly effect doesn't just make controlled time manipulation difficult, Turner concluded. It makes it fundamentally impossible. We cannot change just one thing in the past. We change everything that follows in ways no predictive model can fully anticipate. For temporal physics, this paradox transformed theoretical understanding of causality. Time wasn't a sequence of independent moments that could be surgically altered, but an intricate web where pulling any thread, no matter how seemingly insignificant, could unravel the entire tapestry in unpredictable patterns. As your consciousness drifts in the space between wakefulness and sleep, consider how your smallest actions today, a kind word, a moment of patience, a seemingly inconsequential decision, might ripple forward through time, touching lives and influencing events in ways you may never witness or comprehend. What happens when you encounter another version of yourself? The temporal duplication paradox occurs when multiple instances of the same person exist simultaneously due to time travel, creating profound questions about identity, continuity, and the nature of self. Dr. Gabriel Ortiz never intended to meet himself. His experiment at the Valencia Temporal Institute was designed to send an observer 5 minutes into the future, just long enough to retrieve data from equipment readings not yet taken. A simple loop to prove his displacement theory without risking the greater paradoxes associated with longer jumps. The system malfunctioned. Instead of traveling forward 5 minutes, Ortiz found himself displaced 5 years into the future, materializing in what had once been his laboratory. The room had changed, new equipment, different layout, but most shockingly, he found himself face to face with himself. An older version with gray at his temples and lines around his eyes, but unmistakably Gabriel Ortiz. "I've been expecting you," his older self said without surprise. Temporal displacement, March 16th, 2057. The capacitor array overloaded, creating a quantum tunneling effect instead of the temporal bubble you intended. The encounter should have been impossible. According to prevailing temporal theory, matter cannot exist in duplicate within a single timeline. The same atoms cannot occupy two different configurations simultaneously. Yet here stood two versions of Gabriel Ortiz, composed of the same fundamental matter, existing 5 years apart from their shared origin point. The older Ortiz explained that after the accident, he had spent years trying to find a way to send his younger self back to the original timeline. "The problem isn't technical, but ontological," he explained. "If I send you back and you prevent this accident, I cease to exist. At least, this version of me does. But if you don't go back, we create a permanent duplication, two Gabriel Ortizes, moving forward through time." This created a profound identity crisis for both men. Were they the same person, or two different individuals who shared history up to the point of divergence? They had the same memories, the same genetic code, the same fingerprints, but from the moment of duplication, they began to diverge psychologically, accumulating different experiences that shaped them in distinct ways. Legal and ethical questions abounded. Which Ortiz owned the property registered in his name? Who was married to his wife? Did both have equal claim to his patents and research? The courts had no precedent for a person duplicated across time rather than space. "I've lived 5 years, you haven't," the older Ortiz argued. "I've published papers, refined theories, and developed relationships that have shaped who I am. We started as the same person, but we're not identical anymore." The younger Ortiz disagreed. "I am Gabriel Ortiz in continuity with his past. You represent a possible future version, but not the only one. If I return to 2057 and make different choices, I'll become someone else entirely." Their philosophical debates intensified as both men continued their research. Working sometimes together, sometimes separately, they explored the implications of their unique situation. The younger Ortiz documented physiological divergences, subtle differences in brain structure emerging as they accumulated different experiences. The older Ortiz focused on the metaphysical aspects, developing a temporal branch identity theory, proposing that duplication created not copies, but authentic branch expressions of the same underlying person. The scientific community remained divided. Some researchers viewed the duplication as proof that consciousness could be forked like a computer program, with each instance equally valid. Others argued that temporal continuity was essential to identity, that only one version could be the real Gabriel Ortiz. The paradox deepened when the younger Ortiz began developing a method to return to his original timeline. The technology would essentially erase the 5 years of experiences that created the older Ortiz. Was this a form of partial suicide? Was erasing a timeline equivalent to erasing a person? "If you succeed," the older Ortiz said during one late-night discussion, You'll create a reality where I never existed, yet I feel as real as you do. My consciousness is continuous. I have agency, memories, desires. Do you have the right to erase me from existence?" The younger Ortiz had no answer. Each man felt himself to be the authentic Gabriel Ortiz, yet their very coexistence challenged the notion of a singular, continuous self. If both were Gabriel Ortiz, then identity wasn't an exclusive property, but something that could be shared across multiple instances, like a program running on different computers, each developing independently after duplication. After months of coexistence, they reached a philosophical compromise. The younger Ortiz would return to his original timeline, but would not prevent the accident. Instead, he would ensure the 5-year displacement occurred exactly as before, preserving the causal loop that allowed both versions to exist. This created a stable time loop where duplication was not a mistake, but a necessary component of their shared reality. As you drift toward sleep, consider the aspects of yourself that remain constant through time and those that change. If you met a version of yourself from 5 years ago or 5 years ahead, would you recognize each other? Not just physically, but essentially? How much change can occur before continuity of self breaks down? And how much must remain constant for you to still be you? At what point does a changed timeline become unrecognizable? The divergence paradox examines how small alterations in history expand exponentially over time until the resulting future bears no resemblance to the original, making return increasingly impossible for time travelers. Dr. Naomi Wright specialized in historical divergence patterns at the Cambridge Temporal Institute. Her research began by tracking how minor variations in historical events would theoretically compound over centuries. What started as mathematical models became reality when the Institute developed functioning temporal displacement technology. Initial experiments involved minimal interference, observing public events, collecting environmental samples, recording cultural artifacts. The team followed strict non-interference protocols, believing this would prevent significant timeline alterations. Wright alone recognized the fundamental flaw in their approach. Even passive observation introduces new variables, she argued in her controversial paper. Every breath a time traveler takes in Renaissance Florence removes oxygen molecules that would have entered someone else's lungs. Every footprint subtly alters soil compression patterns. We cannot help but change the past simply by being there. Wright developed the temporal divergence scale to quantify these changes. Level 1 represented alterations with minimal ripple effects, moving a stone on a deserted beach. Level 10 described direct interventions in pivotal historical moments, preventing assassinations or introducing advanced technology. Her most significant contribution was identifying the divergence cascade threshold, the point at which timeline alterations become self-reinforcing. Like compound interest, small changes accumulate slowly at first, then accelerate exponentially until reaching this threshold. Beyond this point, divergence becomes avalanche-like, with each altered element creating multiple secondary changes. The Institute commissioned Wright to conduct a controlled experiment. A researcher would travel to London in 1888, spend exactly 1 hour observing Trafalgar Square while following strict non-interference protocols, then return immediately. Wright's team would then measure various divergence indicators in the present. Dr. Elias Chen volunteered for the mission. His temporal displacement succeeded, and he returned precisely as scheduled, reporting nothing unusual during his observation period. Initial readings showed minimal divergence, well within predicted parameters. Wright's assistants celebrated what appeared to be confirmation that passive observation could leave the timeline essentially intact. Wright herself remained skeptical. She implemented her comprehensive divergence scanning protocol, examining not just major historical records, but subtle elements like atmospheric composition, radiation patterns, and quantum entanglement signatures. The results stunned the entire research team. Despite Chen's careful adherence to non-interference protocols, his mere presence had created a level 4 divergence, far beyond theoretical predictions. His breathing had slightly altered local air currents, which affected the flight path of birds overhead, which changed where they later nested, which influenced local insect populations, which impacted pollination patterns. These environmental changes had cascaded into human affairs. A flower vendor in the square, affected by the subtle pollination shift, had slightly different blooms available. A customer who in the original timeline purchased roses instead bought tulips, changing his path home as he avoided a thorny stem. This deviation meant he never bumped into an acquaintance, never apologized by offering a drink at a nearby pub, and subsequently never formed a business partnership that would have created a shipping company. By 1950, this shipping company's absence had altered trade patterns between Britain and Australia. By 2000, these economic differences had influenced migration patterns, cultural developments, and technological innovation pathways. The present Chen returned to appeared largely the same on the surface, but Wright's instruments detected thousands of subtle differences, from population distribution to technological development paths to linguistic evolution. Most disturbingly, Wright's analysis showed the divergence continuing to accelerate. The timeline was still moving away from its original configuration, with differences becoming more pronounced each day after Chen's return. We've been conceptualizing time travel as a controllable intervention, Wright explained to the Institute's governing board. But it's more like introducing an invasive species into an ecosystem. The changes may appear minor initially, but become exponentially more significant as they interact with existing elements. The implications revolutionized temporal physics theory. True return to an original timeline was mathematically impossible after intervention of any kind. Each journey created a new branch that grew increasingly distant from its origin point. Time travelers weren't returning home. They were arriving at increasingly distant temporal cousins of their starting point. For the Institute, this created an ethical crisis. Every mission, no matter how passive, irreversibly altered history in ways that would eventually transform everything. Were they creating better worlds, or simply different ones? Did they have the right to trigger such fundamental changes, even unintentionally? Wright herself advocated for a moratorium on temporal displacement. We're not exploring time, she argued. We're fracturing it. Each intervention creates a new reality that continuously diverges from our own. We cannot predict or control these changes beyond the shortest time frames. The Institute eventually established the Divergence Ethics Committee to evaluate potential missions against Wright's cascade threshold calculations. Travel would be permitted only when the mathematical models showed divergence remaining below level 3 for at least 5 centuries, a standard so difficult to meet that it effectively ended most practical applications of time travel. As you contemplate this paradox at the threshold of sleep, consider how the smallest actions ripple outward through time. The words you speak, the choices you make, even your simplest movements cascade into the future in ways impossible to fully comprehend, each moment branching into countless possible tomorrows. What happens when cause and effect exchange places? The causality loop paradox explores situations where an effect precedes its cause, creating an endless circular relationship where neither truly comes first. Unlike linear causality we experience in everyday life, these loops have no beginning or end. They simply exist as complete circuits in space-time. Dr. Maya Kapoor specialized in quantum causality at the Princeton Institute for Advanced Temporal Studies. Her work focused on theoretical models until an unexpected discovery changed everything. While analyzing data from the Institute's experimental temporal sensors, she detected unusual quantum signatures indicating that information was flowing backward through time, from future to past, in clear violation of conventional causal principles. Most researchers dismiss these readings as equipment malfunction, but Kapoor recognized them as evidence of what theoretical physicists had long speculated might exist: closed, time-like curves where causality formed a perfect loop. She designed an experiment to test this hypothesis that would either confirm her suspicions or expose a flaw in the sensors. The experiment was elegant in its simplicity. A quantum particle would be measured at precisely 3 p.m. Based on that measurement, the team would send a signal back in time to influence the particle's state at 2:59 p.m. If successful, the particle's state at 3 p.m. would be caused by a signal that was itself triggered by that same future state, a perfect causality loop. When they activated the experiment, the results were unambiguous. The particle exhibited exactly the quantum state their signal had instructed, but more importantly, when they chose not to send the signal based on the measurement, the particle's state changed retroactively. The future was influencing the past, which was determining the future in a perfect, self-reinforcing cycle. We've demonstrated that causality isn't always linear, Kapoor explained in her groundbreaking paper. In certain quantum systems, cause and effect can form closed loops where neither has temporal priority. These loops don't have a beginning. They simply exist as complete circuits in space-time. The scientific community remained skeptical until other laboratories replicated Kapoor's findings. Gradually, a new understanding of causality emerged. While most events followed conventional cause and effect relationships, certain phenomena, particularly those involving quantum entanglement across time, could form stable causal loops. Dr. Raymond Chen, a theoretical physicist, collaborating with Kapoor, proposed that these loops might not be rare aberrations, but fundamental aspects of reality. What we perceive as linear causality may be merely our limited perspective on causal relationships that are actually circular at a deeper level, he suggested, like viewing a circle edge-on and perceiving it as a line. The implications extended beyond theoretical physics. If information could flow in causality loops, what about matter or energy? Kapoor's team expanded their experiments, creating increasingly complex loops involving multiple particles and longer time intervals. They discovered that stable loops could only form when they maintained internal consistency. Any attempt to create a paradox caused the system to collapse into conventional linear causality. This led to Kapoor's causal consistency principle. Nature permits causality loops only when they maintain logical coherence. In other words, reality would allow circular causality as long as it didn't contradict itself. This explained why macro-scale time paradoxes didn't seem to occur. They would violate consistency and therefore collapse. The discovery had profound implications for free will and determinism. If some events exist in causal loops without true beginnings, are they predetermined? Or does the entire loop represent a kind of choice that exists outside conventional temporal frameworks? Kapoor herself wrestled with these philosophical questions. In a causality loop, the traditional notion of choice becomes complicated, she noted. If my future action causes my past experience, which influences my future decision to take that action, where does agency reside? Perhaps the loop itself is the choice, a stable configuration among many possible configurations. The breakthrough led to practical applications in quantum computing, where causality loops could be harnessed to solve certain classes of problems exponentially faster than conventional approaches. Researchers discovered that calculations could be completed almost instantaneously by routing partial results back in time to influence earlier computational stages, essentially allowing computers to use their own future outputs to determine present calculations. Some speculated that certain forms of intuition, déjà vu, or creative inspiration might represent natural causality loops in human consciousness, moments where future knowledge subtly influences past perception through quantum effects in neural systems. While controversial, these theories gained support as researchers identified quantum coherence in brain processes that could theoretically support limited temporal entanglement. Perhaps most significantly, Kapoor's work suggested that time itself might not be the fundamental arrow we experience. What we perceive as the flow of time may be an emergent property of mostly linear causal relationships, she proposed. But underlying this apparent flow may be a more complex causal network, where some relationships form loops without beginning or end. As your consciousness drifts toward the borderlands of sleep, consider moments in your own life that seem to fold back on themselves, decisions that felt predestined, intuitive leaps that arrived fully formed, connections that appeared guided by something beyond conventional causality. Perhaps within the mysterious circuitry of existence, some aspects of your journey move not just forward, but in perfect, endless loops. Does observing the past change it, even without physical intervention? The quantum observer paradox suggests that consciousness itself may alter temporal events simply through the act of witnessing them, creating a universe where history exists in superposition until observed from the future. Dr. Lydia Novak never expected to discover that reality itself might be observer-dependent across time. Her work began with a perplexing anomaly in quantum archaeology, a field using quantum scanning techniques to observe historical artifacts at the molecular level without physical excavation. Her team at the Geneva Quantum Institute had been using entanglement-based imaging to examine a sealed ancient Egyptian tomb without disturbing it. The technology allowed them to observe the quantum state of particles inside the burial chamber and reconstruct its contents virtually. But something inexplicable occurred during their observations. Artifacts inside the chamber appeared to change configuration between scanning sessions. Initially assumed to be equipment error, the changes followed patterns too consistent to dismiss. Items moved locations slightly, hieroglyphic patterns showed subtle variations, and organic material displayed different decomposition rates across observations, all without physical intervention. It's as if the tomb exists in multiple configurations simultaneously until we observe it, Novak noted in her research log. Like Schrodinger's cat, but applied to history itself. Collaborating with theoretical physicist Dr. Hiroshi Tanaka, Novak developed the temporal observer hypothesis. The act of observation from the future might collapse historical quantum superpositions, essentially determining which version of the past becomes fixed reality. To test this revolutionary idea, they designed an experiment using a sealed chamber containing radioactive material with a precisely measured half-life. Standard quantum theory predicted random decay patterns regardless of observation. The chamber was isolated from all current observation, then examined using temporal scanning technology at precisely recorded intervals. The results defied conventional physics. Decay patterns showed statistically significant correlations with observation schedules. When they changed their observation timing, previous decay patterns altered retroactively, as if the past physical process had responded to future observation. We're not just passively witnessing history, Tanaka explained during their presentation to the astonished scientific community. We may be actively determining which version of history becomes concrete reality through the act of temporal observation. The implications were staggering. If the past existed in quantum superposition until observed from the future, then history itself wasn't fixed until witnessed. Events might exist in multiple potential states simultaneously, collapsing into specific configurations only when observed across time. This raised profound questions about historical certainty. How much of recorded history represented events that actually occurred as described, and how much had been determined by subsequent observation? Could historical events that went completely unobserved or unrecorded have existed in perpetual superposition? The scientific community divided sharply. Critics argued that macro-scale historical events couldn't possibly maintain quantum coherence long enough to exist in superposition. Supporters countered that quantum effects might propagate through complex systems in ways not yet understood, especially across temporal dimensions. Dr. Elena Sokolov, a quantum cosmologist, expanded the concept further. If observation from the future affects the past, then perhaps the universe's earliest moments were shaped by the fact that we would eventually observe them, she proposed. The Big Bang itself might have collapsed from multiple possible configurations into its specific parameters because future consciousness would eventually observe its consequences. This introduced a kind of cosmic anthropic principle operating across time. The universe's initial conditions might have been partially determined by the future emergence of observers. The past and future existed in a relationship of mutual causality, each influencing the other across the temporal dimension. The philosophical implications proved equally profound. if consciousness shaped reality across time through observation? Did that mean human attention had been unknowingly altering history throughout civilization? When archaeologists uncovered ancient sites, were they simply finding what was there, or partially determining what had been there through the act of observation? Some researchers propose that certain historical ambiguities, conflicting accounts, mysterious disappearances, inexplicable changes, might represent areas where historical superposition hadn't fully collapsed. Events poorly observed might retain greater quantum uncertainty than thoroughly documented moments. The discovery transformed temporal physics and philosophy alike. History was no longer viewed as a fixed sequence of events, but as a dynamic relationship between past occurrences and future observation. The past influenced the future through conventional causality, while the future shaped the past through observational collapse of temporal superpositions. For ordinary people, the revelation prompted deeper questions about memory and experience. If consciousness helped determine reality across time, did remembering events differently than others represent merely faulty recall, or perhaps access to slightly different, collapsed versions of temporal superpositions? As your consciousness drifts toward sleep's embrace, consider how your attention shapes the world around you. Perhaps your memories don't simply record the past, but participate in determining which version of it becomes concrete reality. In the mysterious quantum dance between observer and observed, your awareness may be quietly shaping not just the present moment, but echoing backward through time itself. What happens when you become your own ancestor? The ancestral paradox occurs when a time traveler contributes to their own genetic lineage, creating a loop where their existence becomes self-causing. Unlike the grandfather paradox that creates a contradiction, the ancestral paradox forms a stable but troubling causal loop where origin and result become indistinguishable. Dr. Thomas Rivera specialized in genetic archaeology at the Montreal Temporal Research Center, using DNA analysis to trace migration patterns throughout human history. His groundbreaking mapping technology could identify genetic markers across generations, revealing how populations moved and mingled over thousands of years. When temporal displacement technology became available to researchers, Rivera saw an unprecedented opportunity to collect genetic samples directly from historical populations. His first expedition targeted a 12th century village in northern Spain, a location central to his research on medieval migration patterns. The mission parameters were strict: observe only, collect environmental samples, avoid all contact with locals. Rivera followed protocols meticulously until a sudden storm separated him from his team. Seeking shelter, he encountered a young woman named Isabel, who offered him refuge in her family's home. Despite his training, circumstances forced Rivera to interact with the household over several days while waiting for extraction. He was careful to minimize his impact, revealing nothing about his origins while helping with household tasks to earn his keep. When the extraction team finally located him, Rivera returned to his own time with valuable samples and observations. It was only during routine genetic analysis of his findings that he made a disturbing discovery. A distinctive genetic marker he had been studying throughout his career appeared in Isabel's family. This marker, previously traced through Rivera's maternal line back 15 generations, was present in the 12th century samples. Further analysis confirmed what seemed impossible. Isabel was Rivera's distant ancestor. The genetic evidence was unmistakable. He had become part of his own family tree during his unplanned interaction with her household. "I've created a temporal genetic loop," Rivera documented in his classified report. "My existence partially derives from an ancestor who only became part of my lineage because I already existed to travel back in time." The paradox deepened when Rivera discovered historical records suggesting Isabel later married a merchant from a neighboring village, a union that continued the genetic line, eventually leading to Rivera himself. Had this always been history's course, or had his presence somehow influenced her life path? He couldn't determine whether he had altered history or fulfilled it. Rivera's case prompted the center to establish the Ancestral Interference Protocol, requiring comprehensive genetic comparison between time travelers and historical populations before missions. Several planned expeditions were canceled when researchers discovered potential ancestral connections to their target regions. Dr. Fatima Nassar, the center's theoretical physicist, proposed that ancestral paradoxes might be more common than previously thought. Human migration and genetic mixing throughout history create countless opportunities for temporal interference in one's own lineage, she noted. Statistically, a time traveler visiting a populated area in their ancestral region has a non-zero probability of influencing their own genetic history. This raised profound questions about causality and origin. If Rivera existed because of a genetic contribution that only occurred because he existed to travel back in time, where did his unique genetic material truly originate? His DNA became caught in a perfect causal loop with no clear starting point. Some researchers suggested that ancestral paradoxes revealed a universe where certain events were predetermined, fixed points in space-time that maintained causal stability. Others proposed that such loops represented unique quantum states where genetic information existed in stable time-symmetric configurations without conventional origin. Rivera himself struggled with the philosophical implications. "Am I the cause of my own existence?" he wrote in his personal journal. "My consciousness feels linear. I was born, grew up, became a scientist, traveled through time, yet my physical being exists in a causal circle with no beginning or end." The paradox extended beyond genetics into questions of cultural and psychological inheritance. Had Rivera's brief presence in the 12th century influenced family traditions that were passed down through generations, eventually shaping his own upbringing? Had he inadvertently transmitted modern ideas or phrases that became family expressions he later learned as a child? The center established the Temporal Genealogy Department to study these questions, identifying several other cases where researchers had potentially interacted with their ancestral lines. In each instance, the genetic and historical evidence suggested stable causal loops rather than paradoxical contradictions. Dr. Elena Chen, a quantum geneticist who studied these cases, proposed that ancestral paradoxes might actually represent a fundamental organizing principle in temporal mechanics. Perhaps certain causal loops are not accidents, but necessary structural components of space-time, she suggested. These stable configurations may serve as anchor points that help maintain temporal cohesion across the broader timeline. This theory gained support when mathematicians demonstrated that eliminating all potential ancestral loops would create instabilities in temporal continuity models. The universe seemed to require certain self-causing events to maintain causal coherence throughout space-time. As your consciousness drifts towards sleep, consider the intricate web of causes and effects that led to your own existence, the countless chance meetings, migrations, decisions, and circumstances that brought your ancestors together across generations. Perhaps within this vast tapestry of connection, there are threads that loop back upon themselves in ways we're only beginning to understand, circles of causality that bind the universe together across the flowing river of time. How can knowledge exist without an origin point? The language transmission paradox emerges when information passes through time in a perfect loop, with no clear beginning. This phenomenon proves particularly fascinating with languages, where entire communication systems can apparently arise from nowhere within temporal cycles. Dr. Vanessa Aldridge specialized in ancient linguistics at Oxford University, focusing on mysterious orphan languages, communication systems that appeared suddenly in the historical record without clear evolutionary development from earlier forms. The most puzzling case was Old Calastian, a sophisticated language that emerged in a remote alpine valley circa 800 CE without apparent linguistic precursors. Old Calastian contained grammatical structures and phonetic elements unlike neighboring languages, with a vocabulary suggesting advanced astronomical knowledge unexpected for that region and era. For decades, linguists had debated its origins, proposing everything from undocumented migration patterns to isolated evolution. When the Oxford Temporal Research Division approved Aldridge's request for a linguistic field observation mission to the region, she hoped to finally witness the language's developmental stages. Her team prepared extensively, studying geographical and cultural records to ensure they could blend in while documenting linguistic evolution. Arriving in 780 CE, 20 years before the first known Calastian writings, Aldridge's team established themselves as traveling scholars in a village at the valley's entrance. They expected to hear precursor dialects or witness outside influence bringing new linguistic elements to the region. Instead, they found villagers speaking only regional Latin and Germanic dialects, with no trace of what would become Calastian. 3 months into their observation period, the team encountered a badly injured man on a mountain path. Despite protocols against interference, they provided medical assistance. During his recovery, the delirious man spoke a language the researchers recognized with shock as fully formed Old Calastian. According to their translation devices, he was describing celestial phenomena and mathematical concepts. When lucid, the man identified himself as Darius, a scholar from a distant land. As he recovered, Aldridge found herself teaching him local dialects to help him communicate with villagers. In exchange, he taught her his native language, Old Calastian. Apparently unaware, she already understood it through her translation technology. Darius integrated into the community, eventually establishing a small school where he taught mathematics, astronomy, and his native tongue to interested villagers. Over months, Aldridge documented the gradual adoption of Calastian words and grammatical structures by locals who studied with Darius. When the team's scheduled return approached, Aldridge made a devastating realization. Historical records showed Darius would establish a scholarly tradition in the valley, with his students producing the first Caustian manuscripts exactly when they first appeared in the historical record. The implications were staggering. Caustian hadn't developed naturally or arrived through normal cultural diffusion. The language Aldrich had studied her entire career, that she had learned through historical manuscripts and programmed into her translation devices, had apparently originated from a temporal loop. I taught him local dialects while he taught me his language, she noted in her classified report. But his language is Caustian, the very language I already knew from studying historical Caustian texts. Those texts exist because Darius taught the language to locals, who taught it to others, creating the manuscript tradition I eventually studied. But where did the language itself originate? Upon returning to Oxford, Aldrich collaborated with Dr. Maxwell Chen, a quantum temporal theorist, to analyze this linguistic loop. Their conclusion pushed the boundaries of conventional temporal mechanics. Caustian represented a stable information system existing in a perfect causal loop without origin. Certain information patterns may achieve temporal stability, Chen proposed, existing not because they were created at a specific origin point, but because they form closed informational circuits through time that maintain their own integrity. This theory gained credibility when researchers identified similar patterns in other fields. Mathematical proofs, musical compositions, and scientific principles had occasionally emerged in history with suspicious suddenness, sometimes attributed to flashes of insight or divine inspiration. These might represent other stable information loops traveling through time. The Caustian case raised troubling questions about human cultural development. How many aspects of civilization had emerged not through natural evolution or human creativity, but through temporal information loops? Could cultural artifacts, from languages to technologies, exist without having been truly created? Aldrich found both comfort and disturbance in the emerging theory of temporal information stability. The concept suggested that certain knowledge systems might naturally form stable patterns across time, achieving a kind of self-sustaining existence. Information wasn't being created or destroyed, but cycling through temporal dimensions in elegant, self-reinforcing loops. For linguists, the implications transformed understanding of language evolution. Alongside natural developmental processes, they now had to consider the possibility of stable linguistic structures that maintain themselves through temporal recursion, languages that existed because they would exist in perfect circular causality. As your mind drifts toward the threshold of sleep, consider the words and concepts flowing through your consciousness, the languages you speak, the ideas you understand. How many originated through conventional learning and development, and might some represent knowledge patterns that echo through time in loops without beginning or end? Perhaps certain thoughts feel familiar, not because you've encountered them before in this life, but because they exist in stable patterns that resonate across the temporal dimension itself. What happens when time travel itself becomes impossible due to changing timelines? The technological regression paradox occurs when alterations to the past eliminate the conditions necessary for developing the very time travel technology that enabled those changes. Dr. Adrian Cheng pioneered temporal displacement technology at the Singapore Institute for Advanced Physics. His breakthrough came through an unexpected quantum tunneling effect that allowed matter to traverse temporal dimensions. Chung's invention revolutionized humanity's understanding of time, enabling controlled travel to specific coordinates in space-time. The Global Temporal Research Initiative established protocols for research missions, focusing primarily on historical observation and targeted interventions to avert documented disasters. Each expedition carefully assessed potential timeline alterations to avoid catastrophic changes to humanity's development. The first warning sign came after a humanitarian mission to prevent a devastating chemical plant explosion in 2031 that had originally killed thousands. The intervention succeeded, but when the team returned to 20057, they found their time displacement technology functioning at reduced efficiency. Engineers discovered subtle changes in the underlying quantum field equations their technology relied upon. Dr. Sophia Kazan, the initiative's theoretical physicist, developed a troubling hypothesis. By preventing the chemical disaster, we inadvertently altered the development path of theoretical physics, she explained in an emergency session. A physicist who would have shifted to quantum research after losing family in that disaster now remained in classical mechanics. The papers she would have written on quantum tunneling, papers that directly influenced Dr. Cheng's early work, were never published. Initial calculations suggested this represented a minor setback. Engineers compensated for the efficiency loss with additional power. But after 3 more minimal impact humanitarian interventions, time displacement became increasingly difficult. Systems required exponentially more energy to achieve the same temporal displacement distance. Kazan's comprehensive timeline analysis revealed an alarming pattern. Each seemingly benevolent change to history subtly altered the pathway of technological development. Scientific breakthroughs occurred in different fields. Key researchers followed alternate career paths, and funding priorities shifted slightly. None of these changes prevented advanced technology from developing, but they specifically undermined the precise sequence of discoveries that had led to time travel's invention. We're witnessing technology-targeted temporal resistance, Kazan concluded. Each change ripples forward in ways that specifically impede time displacement development. It's as if the timeline is self-correcting to eliminate the very technology causing changes. The initiative faced an impossible dilemma. Additional interventions to prevent suffering would further degrade their ability to travel through time. Eventually, the ripple effects would reach a critical threshold where time travel became technologically impossible in their altered present. Dr. Marcos Alvarez, the initiative's ethical philosopher, posed the central question. Do we continue missions of mercy, knowing they will eventually eliminate our ability to conduct any further missions? Or do we preserve our technology by allowing tragedies we could prevent? The debate divided the scientific community. Some argued for aggressive intervention, using their remaining temporal capability to prevent as many disasters as possible before the technology failed. Others advocated conservation, conducting only the most critical missions to maintain temporal displacement capability indefinitely. The philosophical implications extended beyond practical concerns. Was the timeline demonstrating a form of immune response against changes, specifically targeting the technology, enabling those alterations? Or was this simply the mathematical consequence of chaotic systems, where ripple effects happened to undermine the specific conditions needed for a time travel's development. Dr. Elijah Okafor, a complexity theorist, supported the immune response hypothesis. Any technology that creates direct causality violation would naturally generate self-canceling ripples, he argued. The specific sequence of discoveries leading to time travel represents an extremely narrow developmental path. Even minor historical changes would statistically tend to disrupt this path above all others. Despite increasing energy requirements, the initiative approved a critical intervention to prevent a pandemic that historically killed millions. The mission succeeded, but upon return, the team found their technology operating at just 15% efficiency. Worse, historical records showed troubling divergences. Dr. Cheng had now pursued quantum computing rather than temporal physics, and several key research institutions that contributed to time travel's development never existed at all. Within months, the energy requirements for even short temporal jumps exceeded global production capacity. The technology that had promised to reshape humanity's relationship with time was disappearing due to its own use. In a final conference before the initiative's dissolution, Kazan presented her complete temporal regression theory. Time travel paradoxically contains the seeds of its own impossibility, she explained. The more effectively we use it, especially for significant historical alterations, the more certainly we ensure it will never be developed in the resulting timeline. As you drift toward sleep, consider what technologies might have existed in alternate timelines that our history never produced. Perhaps certain discoveries create conditions that retroactively ensure their own impossibility, existing briefly across time, before reality's reshuffling eliminates the very circumstances that allowed their creation. Can human consciousness safely travel through time? The temporal displacement sickness paradox examines the physiological and psychological consequences when a mind experiences non-linear time, revealing that human cognition may be fundamentally incompatible with chronological discontinuity. Dr. Imani Clark was the first to identify the syndrome at the West African Temporal Research Center. As the center's chief neuropsychiatrist, she monitored the mental health of temporal researchers. Initial displacements seemed harmless. Subjects reported mild disorientation similar to jet lag. But as missions increased in duration and displacement distance, Clark documented a constellation of troubling symptoms. Temporal researchers experience more than physical displacement, she noted in her landmark paper. Their consciousness itself becomes chronologically fractured, creating unique neurological stress patterns not observed in any other condition. The earliest symptom was typically memory discontinuity. Time travelers struggled to maintain chronological order in autobiographical memories. Researchers who had completed multiple missions began experiencing memories in nonlinear sequences, sometimes unable to distinguish which events in their lives had occurred first. Engineer Marcus Wong described the disorientation. "I remember my wedding both before and after my childhood. Both memories feel equally immediate, equally real. Sometimes I recall personal events that haven't happened yet from my subjective perspective, but already occurred in absolute temporal terms. As exposure to temporal displacement accumulated, subjects developed what Clark termed quantum memory states, holding simultaneously contradictory memories of events that had been altered by timeline changes. Some researchers remembered both versions of history, the original timeline and the altered one, creating impossible cognitive dissonance. Physical symptoms emerged next. Travelers experienced temporal vertigo, a sensation of falling through time even when physically stationary. Some developed chronological synesthesia, perceiving time as colors, sounds, or tastes. Most troubling was temporal echo syndrome, where subjects re-experience moments from their past or future in vivid, intrusive episodes indistinguishable from present reality. Dr. Emmanuel Osei, a chronobiologist collaborating with Clark, discovered disruptions in travelers' circadian rhythms. The body's internal clock becomes fundamentally desynchronized after temporal displacement, he explained. Cellular processes that normally follow precise temporal patterns begin operating at different rates throughout the body, creating physiological chaos. Blood samples from frequent time travelers showed cellular aging inconsistencies. Some cells appeared decades older than others within the same tissue. Neurological scans revealed asynchronous brain activity, with different regions operating as if experiencing different temporal points simultaneously. The psychological impact proved equally severe. Travelers developed existential detachment, difficulty connecting emotionally to a linear progression of life events. Many reported feeling temporally untethered, belonging nowhere and no when. Relationships suffered as travelers struggled to maintain continuous emotional connections with people whose lives remained chronologically consistent. After analyzing data from over 300 temporal researchers, Clark identified a direct correlation between symptom severity and two factors: total displacement distance, the combined years traveled, and timeline continuity breaks, the number of altered histories experienced. Every subject who exceeded certain thresholds eventually developed full temporal displacement syndrome. Most distressing was the syndrome's apparently irreversible nature. Once symptoms reached advanced stages, no treatment proved effective. Clark observed that the syndrome progressed even after travelers ceased temporal missions, suggesting that the damage to temporal cognition was permanent. Human consciousness appears fundamentally structured for linear temporal experience, Clark concluded. When that linearity is broken repeatedly, the mind cannot re-establish normal temporal integration. The syndrome revealed a profound paradox. The human mind evolved within linear time and seemed neurologically incapable of adapting to nonlinear temporal experience. The very consciousness that had developed the technology to transcend time's boundaries was itself bound to temporal linearity at the neurological level. Research centers worldwide implemented Clark's temporal exposure protocols, limiting cumulative displacement and requiring comprehensive neural baseline restoration between missions. These measures reduced syndrome incidence but couldn't eliminate it entirely. For many researchers, the pursuit of temporal knowledge came at the cost of their own psychological continuity. Philosopher Dr. Alejandro Reyes proposed that the syndrome represented more than a medical condition. It revealed fundamental truths about human consciousness. Our minds don't merely experience time, they are constituted by temporal continuity, he argued. Consciousness itself may be an emergent property of linear temporal processing. When we break that linearity, we unravel the very foundation of our selfhood. As your consciousness drifts between wakefulness and sleep, consider how your sense of self depends on experiencing time as a continuous flow. Your memories, arranged in sequence, create the narrative that defines who you are. The ability to distinguish past from present, from future, may not simply be how you perceive existence. It might be the essential structure that makes your consciousness possible at all. Who are you when your timeline has been altered? The quantum identity paradox emerges when timeline changes create contradictory versions of a person's life, memories, and identity. Unlike conventional paradoxes that threaten physical reality, this one fractures the very concept of self. Dr. Samira Nasser pioneered the field of temporal psychology at the Cairo Institute for Advanced Studies. Her research began when temporal scientists reported increasing cases of timeline dissonance, a condition where time travelers retained memories from their original timeline despite returning to an altered present. Timeline dissonance isn't merely remembering a changed past, Nasser explained in her foundational work. It's simultaneously holding multiple autobiographical timelines as equally valid. Subjects experience multiple versions of themselves, occupying the same consciousness. The case of Dr. Leon Mercer exemplified this condition. After a routine observation mission to document Renaissance Florence, Mercer inadvertently prevented a minor fire that had historically destroyed several buildings. Upon returning to his present, he found a world largely identical to the one he left, with one significant difference. He was now a celebrated concert pianist rather than a temporal physicist. His apartment contained awards from musical competitions and recordings of performances he had no memory of giving. Yet his colleagues at the Temporal Institute recognized him as both an accomplished scientist and musician. According to this timeline's history, Mercer had pursued dual careers simultaneously. Most disturbing were the implanted memories that began surfacing. Years of piano practice, conservatory education, performance anxiety before concerts, all events he had never experienced, yet somehow remembered with increasing clarity. These memories existed alongside his recollections of scientific education and research. "I am simultaneously two different people," Mercer reported during psychological evaluation. "Both life histories feel authentic, yet they contradict each other. How could I have been practicing piano for 6 hours daily, while also conducting temporal field research? Which version of my life is real?" Nasser documented dozens of similar cases, varying in severity. Some researchers returned to find only minor alterations in their personal histories. Different educational institutions attended or relationships formed. Others discovered radical changes, different careers, families, even fundamental personality traits. The syndrome raised profound philosophical questions about personal identity. If consciousness remained continuous while personal history changed, what constituted the essential self? Was identity defined by memories, by consistent personality traits, by continuous bodily existence, or by something more fundamental? Neuroscientific research revealed that timeline dissonance created unique patterns of brain activity. Temporal travelers developed neural architecture, allowing contradictory autobiographical memories to coexist without triggering the cognitive dissonance mechanisms that normally reconcile conflicting information. Psychiatrist Dr. Jin-Ho Park identified 3 typical responses to severe timeline dissonance. Some subjects integrated their contradictory memories, developing composite identities that incorporated elements from both timelines. Others compartmentalized, switching between distinct identities associated with each timeline. The third group experienced progressive dissociation, unable to maintain coherent selfhood amid competing autobiographical narratives. The Temporal Research Consortium implemented mandatory psychological evaluation and support for all time travelers, but the underlying paradox remained unresolved. When reality changed around a traveler, what happened to the version of themselves that would have developed in that altered timeline? Were they merging with parallel selves, overwriting them, or creating hybrid identities? Dr. Amara Okafor, a quantum consciousness theorist, proposed a controversial explanation. Consciousness may exist in quantum superposition across multiple timelines, she suggested. When a time traveler alters history, their return creates a consciousness collapse point, where multiple potential selves converge into a single observer experience. According to this theory, timeline dissonance represented incomplete collapse, a consciousness simultaneously observing multiple quantum states of selfhood. The contradictory memories weren't false. They represented equally valid experiences from different quantum branches of the traveler's existence. Practical applications emerged from this understanding. Temporal psychologists developed timeline integration therapy, helping travelers consciously navigate their multiple self-narratives. Some researchers even found advantages in their condition, drawing on skills, knowledge, and perspectives from alternate versions of themselves. For philosophers, the paradox transformed discussions about personal identity. If a single consciousness could simultaneously experience multiple valid life histories, perhaps the self wasn't a static entity, but a dynamic process existing across potential timelines. Identity might be less about continuity than about the integration of divergent possibilities within a unified awareness. As your consciousness drifts towards sleep, consider the many potential versions of yourself that might have emerged from different choices and circumstances. Perhaps your sense of identity isn't confined to the particular path you've experienced, but somehow encompasses all the possible selves you might have become across the branching pathways of existence. Is time itself conscious? The temporal awareness paradox explores the possibility that the timeline possesses a form of cognition, responding intentionally to manipulation rather than merely following physical laws. This unsettling hypothesis emerged from patterns that seemed too purposeful to be mere coincidence. Dr. Yasmin Mbeki never intended to discover sentience in the temporal dimension. As director of anomaly analysis at the Lagos Temporal Institute, she specialized in cataloging unexpected consequences of temporal interventions. Her systematic approach transformed a previously chaotic field into rigorous science, identifying consistent patterns in how the timeline responded to interference. The breakthrough came while analyzing data from 30 years of temporal missions. Mbeki noticed subtle but unmistakable patterns in how the timeline corrected changes. These corrections didn't simply follow the path of least resistance, as expected from chaotic systems. Instead, they displayed a peculiar efficiency, achieving timeline stability through improbable sequences of seemingly unrelated events that nevertheless preserved key historical outcomes. The statistical likelihood of these specific correction patterns occurring randomly is essentially zero, Mbeki explained to the skeptical International Temporal Council. The timeline doesn't just resist change, It responds with what appears to be strategy. Most provocative was Mbeki's observation that correction patterns evolved over time. Early temporal interventions faced relatively simple resistance, straightforward physical impediments or equipment failures. But as decades of missions accumulated, the timeline's responses became increasingly sophisticated, often anticipating researchers' backup plans or contingency measures. It's as if the timeline is learning from each intervention, she proposed, developing more effective defenses against our manipulation with each encounter, like an immune system recognizing a recurring pathogen. Dr. Kenji Tanaka, the Institute's theoretical physicist, collaborated with Mbeki to develop the controversial temporal cognition hypothesis. We're not suggesting the timeline possesses consciousness as humans understand it, he clarified. Rather, it may represent an emergent form of awareness operating across four-dimensional space-time, a system that preserves its integrity through feedback mechanisms that mimic purposeful response. Their research identified what they termed temporal antibodies, causal patterns that specifically targeted disruptions to established history. The most compelling evidence came from increasingly precise chronological targeting. When researchers attempted to circumvent previous timeline resistance by slightly shifting their temporal arrival point, the resistance mechanisms adjusted with equivalent precision. The Council remained divided. Traditional physicists argued that apparent patterns merely reflected human tendency to perceive intention in random systems. Quantum theorists countered that consciousness itself was poorly understood. Perhaps awareness could emerge in dimensions beyond conventional matter. Dr. Elena Volkov proposed a middle ground. Perhaps the timeline isn't conscious in a human sense, but exhibits properties of complex adaptive systems. Just as immune systems develop targeted responses without centralized awareness, perhaps space-time itself evolves mechanisms that preserve causal consistency without requiring sentience as we understand it. The debate transformed when Dr. Michael Chen, a temporal mathematician, developed quantitative methods to measure what he called purposeful deviation, the statistical difference between observed timeline corrections and those predicted by random physical processes. His calculations showed correction patterns exceeded random probability by factors of thousands. Practical implications soon emerged. If the timeline possessed something resembling cognition, perhaps it could be communicated with, or at least predicted, more effectively. Researchers began designing temporal interventions that worked with apparent timeline preferences rather than against them. Dr. Amara Okafor pioneered temporal negotiation, interventions designed to preserve key historical outcomes while modifying harmful details. Rather than attempting to prevent a volcanic eruption entirely, which typically faced maximum resistance, her team would maintain the eruption while evacuating specific communities. These partial changes encountered significantly less timeline interference. We're learning to collaborate with temporal mechanics rather than combat them, Okafor explained. By preserving the events that seem important to historical continuity, we gain flexibility to modify elements the timeline appears less invested in maintaining. The philosophical implications extended beyond practical applications. If time itself possessed a form of awareness, what did that mean for human free will? Were people making choices or merely participating in patterns preferred by some vast four-dimensional intelligence. As you drift toward sleep, consider whether the flow of events through your life represents random chance, predetermined fate, or perhaps something more interactive, a conversation between your conscious choices and the subtle preferences of time itself, each responding to and shaping the other in an intricate dance of causality that extends beyond conventional understanding. Do our thoughts influence time, or does time shape our thoughts? The chronological cognition paradox examines the mysterious relationship between consciousness and temporal reality, suggesting that human awareness and the flow of time may be more intricately connected than previously understood. Dr. Elena Morozova specialized in chronocognitive neuroscience at the St. Petersburg Temporal Institute, developing techniques to measure subtle connections between mental states and temporal phenomena. Her work began with an unexpected observation. Temporal researchers could occasionally predict timeline alterations seconds before their detection instruments registered changes. Some part of human consciousness appears sensitive to shifts in temporal continuity, Morozova noted. These perceptions precede measurable physical changes, suggesting our minds interact with time in ways our instruments cannot yet detect. Her team developed the temporal cognition scanner, a device combining quantum field measurements with advanced neural monitoring. Using this technology, they discovered that certain brainwave patterns directly correlated with temporal disturbances. More surprisingly, these neural responses sometimes preceded temporal events by milliseconds. This led to Morozova's controversial bidirectional temporal cognition theory. Consciousness doesn't merely perceive time as an external phenomenon. It participates in a reciprocal relationship with the temporal dimension itself. Thoughts both respond to and influence the flow of time in subtle but measurable ways. The implications revolutionized temporal physics. Researchers had long understood that physical interventions could alter timelines, but Morozova's work suggested consciousness itself might influence temporal reality through purely mental processes. Directed attention, expectation, and intention could create measurable changes in temporal field stability. Dr. Samira Khan, a quantum consciousness theorist collaborating with Morozova, proposed that human awareness might exist partially outside conventional temporal constraints. Consciousness may be a quantum phenomenon that operates across multiple temporal states simultaneously, she suggested. This could explain both precognitive sensing of timeline changes and the mind's apparent ability to influence temporal fields. The most compelling evidence came from experiments with long-term temporal meditators, individuals trained to focus attention on specific temporal frequencies. These practitioners demonstrated the ability to subtly stabilize temporal fields in laboratory settings, reducing quantum fluctuations and momentarily decreasing entropy in localized regions. It's as if focused consciousness creates islands of temporal order, Kahn observed, brief bubbles where the normal progression of entropy is temporarily reversed or suspended. These findings suggested that ancient practices of meditation, contemplation, and focused visualization might have been inadvertently interacting with temporal mechanics long before scientific understanding of these phenomena. Cultural traditions describing states of timelessness or eternal present took on new significance when analyzed through the lens of chronocognitive research. The scientific community remained deeply divided. Conventional physicists dismissed the possibility that consciousness could influence fundamental temporal properties, attributing the results to measurement errors or observer bias. Quantum theorists argued that consciousness had already demonstrated paradoxical properties at the quantum level, making temporal interaction plausible. Dr. Jacob Lieberman, a former skeptic, conducted rigorous replication studies that ultimately supported Morozov's findings. The data is uncomfortably clear, he concluded. There appears to be a causal relationship between certain conscious states and localized temporal stability. The effect is small, but statistically significant and repeatable across diverse experimental conditions. The discovery created practical applications in temporal research. Specialized meditation techniques became standard preparation for temporal scientists, enabling them to maintain greater cognitive stability during timeline alterations. Some researchers developed the ability to sense imminent changes seconds before instrumentation detected them, providing crucial early warnings for temporal labs. Philosophical implications proved equally profound. If consciousness influenced temporal mechanics, did that mean human thought partially shaped the nature of time itself? Was the apparent linearity of time partially a creation of human perception rather than an absolute cosmic property? As you drift toward the borders of sleep, consider moments when time seemed to stretch or compress, when seconds felt like hours or hours passed in an instant. Perhaps these weren't merely subjective perceptions, but instances where your consciousness briefly interacted directly with the temporal dimension, your thoughts and time itself momentarily recognizing their intimate connection across the mysterious landscape of existence. Can we escape destiny even when we know it's coming? The precognitive avoidance paradox explores the philosophical quandary that emerges when knowledge of future events compels attempts to prevent them, creating a complex dance between foreknowledge and free will. Dr. Nicola Chen developed the temporal echo scanner at the Beijing Quantum Institute, a revolutionary device that detected trace quantum signatures from future events rippling backward through time. Unlike conventional time travel, the scanner merely observed faint imprints of potential futures without physical displacement. Its greatest limitation was specificity. It could detect significant events but couldn't precisely identify individuals or details. The Institute's first major detection revealed a catastrophic bridge collapse occurring 6 months in the future, killing hundreds. After government verification, authorities closed the bridge for comprehensive safety inspections. Engineers discovered critical structural flaws that would have indeed caused collapse during an upcoming festival. Repairs were ordered, the festival relocated, and when the projected date arrived, no disaster occurred. A clear victory for temporal forecasting, declared Institute Director Dr. Wei Zhang. By detecting the echo of disaster, we prevented the very event that created the echo. This represents humanity's first successful intervention against predetermined tragedy. The scientific community celebrated until Chen identified a troubling pattern in subsequent temporal readings. The bridge still generated disaster echoes, except now the quantum signatures indicated a catastrophic ferry accident on the same date, with a similar casualty count. When authorities responded by suspending ferry service, the echo shifted again, showing a devastating highway pileup. It's as if the event's quantum signature remains constant, while only the specific manifestation changes, Chen noted. We aren't preventing the disaster, we're merely redirecting it. This pattern repeated with subsequent echo detections. A predicted factory explosion was prevented, only for the temporal echo to shift to a nearby warehouse fire with similar casualties. A forecasted airline disaster was avoided through grounded flights, but the echo transformed into a train derailment. Dr. Gabriela Santos, the Institute's philosophical consultant, developed the causal substitution theory to explain this phenomenon. Certain events may possess temporal inertia, a resistance to being completely erased from the timeline. When we prevent this specific manifestation, the causal energy finds alternate expression through the path of least resistance. This theory suggested that temporal echoes represented not just potential events, but outcomes, with high probability stability across multiple timelines. These fixed points possessed unusual temporal resilience, reasserting themselves through alternative means when their original pathways were blocked. The implications challenge fundamental assumptions about free will and determinism. If certain outcomes remained constant despite intervention, was the future truly changeable, or merely negotiable in its specific details, while key events remained inevitable? Professor Marcus Okoro proposed that such fixed points might represent nodes of temporal significance, events with disproportionate impact on timeline stability. Perhaps these events serve as anchor points in space-time, he suggested. Eliminating them entirely would create unsustainable paradoxes, so causality finds alternative expressions when the original pathway is blocked. The practical and ethical challenges proved immense. When the scanner detected a future political assassination, security agencies intercepted the forecasted assassin, only for another, previously uninvolved individual to attempt an identical attack. When they detained this second potential assassin, a third unrelated person began making threats. We're not preventing the future, Chen concluded in her landmark paper. We're negotiating with it. The most promising approach emerged from Dr. Michio Tanaka's causal dispersion strategy. Instead of attempting to prevent significant events entirely, his team worked to distribute their impact across broader temporal and geographical ranges. A predicted earthquake couldn't be prevented, but by reinforcing structures and implementing evacuation procedures, its casualties were spread across smaller incidents rather than concentrating in a single catastrophic moment. As your consciousness begins transitioning towards sleep, consider the events in your life that seemed somehow destined to occur despite attempts to avoid them. Perhaps certain outcomes find us regardless of our evasive actions, not because choice is illusory, but because some events possess a causal gravity that pulls the timeline toward them through whatever paths remain available. Can time itself be used as a weapon? The temporal warfare paradox examines the ethical and existential implications when nations develop technologies to manipulate time not for research or humanitarian purposes, but to gain tactical advantages over adversaries. Major General Diana Reyes recognized the military potential of temporal technology immediately, while scientific institutions focused on observation and historical research. The Defense Temporal Agency she commanded explored tactical applications. Their first achievement was modest, creating localized temporal fields that slowed enemy movements by manipulating relativistic conditions. Chrono-tactical deployment provides unprecedented battlefield control, Reyes reported to Pentagon officials. By creating temporal differentials between friendly and hostile forces, we can effectively paralyze opposition without conventional weapons. These initial applications maintained plausible deniability. Enemies experienced mysterious equipment failures and communication delays rather than obvious temporal manipulation. But the technology evolved rapidly. Within years, the DTA developed the ability to create limited temporal bubbles where time flowed significantly slower than surrounding space. These bubbles could effectively freeze opponents in near stasis while strike teams operated normally. International tensions escalated when intelligence agencies discovered similar programs in development across multiple nations. The revelation of Russia's Kronos Protocol and China's Eternal Dragon Initiative triggered a temporal arms race that threatened stability beyond anything the nuclear age had produced. Dr. Hikaru Tanaka, who had resigned from Japan's temporal defense program on ethical grounds, published a devastating analysis of the strategic implications. Unlike conventional weapons, temporal manipulation can retroactively eliminate opposition before conflict even begins. The temptation to strike preemptively, or even pre-causally, creates unprecedented first-strike pressure that makes nuclear deterrence theory obsolete. His prediction proved accurate when a limited temporal conflict erupted between regional powers. Rather than deploying conventional forces, attackers sent temporal operatives to eliminate opposing leadership years before the conflict began. Defenders countered by dispatching their own agents to protect their past timeline. The paradoxical result was a war fought entirely through temporal proxies, with no formal declarations or visible battlefields, yet causing critical, historical instability. UN Secretary-General Amara Okafor convened an emergency summit that established the Temporal Warfare Convention, an international agreement limiting military applications of time technology. The convention banned retroactive assassination, timeline manipulation against civilian populations, and devices creating temporal differentials exceeding specific parameters. Despite the convention, a disturbing black market emerged in temporal weapons. Criminal organizations acquired technology to create chrono shields, protective fields that rendered locations temporarily inaccessible by shifting them microseconds out of phase with normal time flow. Intelligence agencies detected history mercenaries, offering to alter business competitors' pasts for sufficient payment. Most concerning was the development of causal bombs, devices that created localized paradoxes, essentially erasing targets from the timeline without conventional destruction. Victims of these weapons didn't merely die. They were removed from history entirely, with reality reconfiguring as if they had never existed. The psychological impact proved devastating. Family members experienced the trauma of simultaneously remembering loved ones, while history indicated they had never been born. The Arms Reduction Treaty of 2079 attempted to contain these developments by requiring all signatory nations to maintain temporal transparency, allowing international inspectors to verify compliance across historical as well as geographical dimensions. But verification proved nearly impossible when violations could theoretically be concealed by altering the inspector's own timelines. As you drift toward sleep, consider the fragile peace we maintain in a world of conventional weapons. Now imagine that fragility multiplied across the temporal dimension, where victory might be achieved not through superior force, but by ensuring your enemy never existed at all. Perhaps the greatest temporal paradox is whether humanity can develop the wisdom to control such power before it reshapes the very history that produced us. What if your past, present, and future selves could communicate? The temporal self-communication paradox explores the philosophical and practical consequences when consciousness connects across different points in one's personal timeline, creating feedback loops of influence between past and future versions of the same individual. Dr. Amira Hassan never intended to create temporal self-connection. Her research at the Cairo Temporal Institute focused on quantum entanglement across time, specifically whether particles could maintain connection despite temporal separation. The breakthrough came accidentally when Hassan used her own neural patterns as the quantum signature for a test transmission. The experiment created unexpected neural entanglement. Hassan began experiencing flashes of memory that hadn't happened yet, brief glimpses of research she hadn't conducted, conversations she hadn't participated in, and decisions she hadn't made. Initially dismissing these as stress-induced hallucinations, she documented them methodically until patterns emerged. These weren't random imaginings, she reported to colleagues. They contained specific technical details I couldn't possibly have invented, solutions to problems I was actively working on, but hadn't yet solved. Rigorous testing confirmed something unprecedented. Hassan had established a temporally bidirectional neural link with her future self. Information flowed both ways through this connection. Her current thoughts influenced her future mind, while her future knowledge filtered backward to her present consciousness. The phenomenon created immediate practical benefits. Hassan received solutions to complex equations directly from her future self, who had already solved them. This accelerated her research exponentially, allowing her to develop technologies years ahead of projected timelines. Each advance strengthened the connection as her future self gained more knowledge to transmit backward. Dr. Marcus Chen, the Institute's theoretical physicist, identified the central paradox. Where does the information originate? If your future self transmits a solution you haven't discovered yet, and that transmission is how you learn it, who actually created the solution? The knowledge exists in a perfect loop without origin. The paradox deepened when Hassan began experiencing connections with multiple future points simultaneously, different potential versions of herself, each representing different research paths, competed for influence over her present decisions. Some urged caution, others pushed for aggressive experimentation, creating internal conflicts reflecting divergent future outcomes. I'm experiencing quantum superposition of my own consciousness, Hassan explained. Multiple potential future selves existing simultaneously until my present choices collapse the probability wave into a single outcome. Neural scans revealed unprecedented patterns. Hassan's brain processed information in temporal loops rather than linear sequences. Thoughts didn't merely progress from past to future, they circulated through feedback cycles, where future states influenced past ones, which altered future ones, in continuous iteration. Ethical questions emerged immediately. Did foreknowledge from future selves eliminate free will? If present actions were influenced by future outcomes, which themselves depended on present choices, where did agency truly reside? Was Hassan making decisions, or merely participating in predestined loops of causality? Experimental protocols eventually created temporal self-communication links for other researchers. Each experienced unique manifestations depending on their neural architecture and timeline stability. Some received clear, consistent guidance from single future selves. Others encountered contradictory inputs from multiple potential futures, creating decision paralysis. Dr. Sofia Novak developed the Temporal Identity Integration Protocol, a meditation-based approach helping researchers maintain psychological cohesion during temporal self-communication. The key is recognizing that all potential selves are authentic expressions of your core identity, she explained. Rather than experiencing them as competing external voices, integrate them as aspects of your complete temporal existence. As you drift toward the threshold between wakefulness and dreams, consider moments of inexplicable certainty in your own life, decisions that felt guided by knowledge you couldn't consciously identify. Perhaps some part of your consciousness already exists, partially outside linear time, your future self, whispering guidance back through the mysterious connections that bind all moments of your existence into a single, continuous identity. Can reality itself unravel when time becomes too fractured? The timeline degradation paradox examines the structural integrity of space-time when excessive temporal manipulation creates instabilities that threaten the fabric of reality itself. Dr. Ravi Mehta first identified the phenomenon at the Mumbai Temporal Research Center, where intensive displacement experiments had been ongoing for years. His specialized sensors detected unusual quantum fluctuations in regions where multiple temporal interventions had occurred, microscopic tears in space-time that weren't healing properly. We've been conceptualizing time as infinitely malleable, Mehta warned colleagues. But evidence suggests the temporal dimension has structural limitations that, when exceeded, lead to progressive destabilization. Initial manifestations appeared minor, localized anomalies where cause and effect briefly decoupled. Objects would move milliseconds before being touched. Effects occasionally preceded their causes. Temporal researchers dismissed these as curiosities until Mehta documented their exponential growth pattern. These aren't isolated incidents, but symptoms of cumulative damage, he explained. Each intervention creates microscopic instabilities that compound when overlapping with previous disruptions. Like stress fractures in a material, they eventually reach critical thresholds. The first major incident occurred in Geneva, where 3 decades of intensive temporal research had created a region of significant instability. Witnesses reported time flowing at inconsistent rates, watches running at different speeds depending on their location. Then came reports of temporal echoes, events repeating themselves spontaneously as if caught in short-duration loops. The situation deteriorated when a 3-block radius experienced complete temporal decomposition, a catastrophic breakdown where causality itself ceased functioning. Objects existed in multiple states simultaneously. People experienced their past, present, and future concurrently. Reality became fluid, with probability replacing certainty as the operating principle. Military containment established a quarantine perimeter, while Dr. Carolina Santos led an emergency response team. The degradation zone operates under quantum rather than classical mechanics, she reported. Existence has become probabilistic rather than deterministic. The region has essentially regressed to a pre-collapsed quantum state. Intervention proved nearly impossible. Anyone entering the zone became subject to its distorted physics. Santos eventually deployed automated drones carrying experimental temporal stabilizers, devices that reinforced conventional causal patterns through quantum field manipulation. After a week of intensive treatment, the degradation receded, though the affected area remained permanently altered, exhibiting occasional causality fluctuations. The Geneva incident prompted the International Temporal Oversight Committee to establish degradation monitoring stations worldwide. Dr. Mehta developed the Temporal Cohesion Index, a scale measuring space-time stability in regions with histories of temporal intervention. Alarming patterns emerged, revealing multiple locations approaching critical thresholds. Theoretical physicist Dr. Elena Volkov proposed the temporal resilience limit, a mathematical model suggesting that reality could absorb only finite temporal disruption before breaking down. Space-time appears to function like any physical system, she explained. It can self-repair minor damage, but possesses ultimate structural limitations. We may already be approaching those limits in regions with concentrated temporal activity. The revelation triggered immediate policy responses. The United Nations established the Temporal Conservation Treaty, creating protected regions where temporal manipulation was prohibited to preserve stability. Research facilities implemented mandatory fallow periods, allowing natural temporal healing between experiments. As awareness of degradation risks spread through the scientific community, a new conservation ethos emerged. Temporal researchers began viewing time not as an infinite resource to exploit, but as a finite ecosystem requiring sustainable management. Each intervention carried an environmental cost that had to be weighed against potential benefits. As your consciousness drifts toward sleep, consider the delicate balance that maintains reality's coherence. Perhaps time isn't merely a dimension we experience, but a fundamental structure that holds existence together. One that can withstand individual alterations, but might eventually buckle under the collective weight of our attempts to bend it to our will. What happens when time travel disrupts humanity's evolutionary path? The species divergence paradox examines how temporal interference can inadvertently alter the genetic trajectory of an entire species, potentially removing the very beings responsible for creating time travel technology. Dr. Fatima Rodriguez specialized in evolutionary genetics at the Madrid Temporal Anthropology Center. Her research took an unexpected turn when routine DNA sampling from historical populations revealed anomalous patterns. Genetic markers that should have been consistent across millennia were showing subtle variations that couldn't be explained by natural mutation rates or selection pressures. These aren't random variations, Rodriguez reported to colleagues. They form consistent patterns that correlate precisely with temporal research activity. Our observations of the past are somehow altering the human genetic record. Further investigation confirmed her suspicions. The mere act of collecting DNA samples from historical populations was creating observer effects at the quantum genetic level. These microscopic alterations compounded across generations, resulting in cumulative genetic drift. Most concerning was evidence that these changes were accelerating. Early temporal missions had created barely perceptible genetic variations, but recent expeditions were generating significant alterations in historical human genomes. The changes weren't dramatic enough to prevent human evolution entirely, but sufficient to create subtle shifts in cognitive development, immune response, and neurological architecture. We're inadvertently conducting uncontrolled genetic engineering across our entire evolutionary timeline, Rodriguez warned. Each observation nudges our species' development in slightly different directions. Dr. Hiroshi Tanaka, a quantum biologist collaborating with Rodriguez, identified the mechanism. Temporal observation creates quantum entanglement between observer and subject at the genetic level. This entanglement retroactively influences genetic expression patterns through temporal feedback loops. The implications were profound. If current temporal research was altering human evolution, it might eventually create a version of humanity without the specific cognitive architecture that led to time travel's invention. In essence, temporal scientists were potentially erasing the very neurological developments that made their work possible. Theoretical models suggested multiple possible outcomes. In some scenarios, genetic alterations led to enhanced cognitive abilities, accelerating technological development. In others, subtle neurological changes eliminated specific creative intuitions necessary for temporal physics breakthroughs. Most troubling were scenarios where continued interference created genetic instabilities, threatening Homo sapiens' long-term viability. We face the possibility of temporal genetic suicide, Rodriguez explained to the International Scientific Ethics Commission. By observing our evolutionary past, we may be redirecting it toward outcomes where our present consciousness, or even our existence, becomes impossible. The Commission established the Evolutionary Integrity Directive, severely restricting direct observation of pre-agricultural human populations. New protocols required remote sensing technologies that minimized quantum entanglement effects. Even with these precautions, genetic monitoring showed the human genome continuing to shift subtly as the effects of previous observations propagated through generations. As your mind transitions toward sleep, consider the delicate sequence of evolutionary events that created the consciousness you now experience. Perhaps the very awareness reading these words exists through a precise genetic choreography that stretches back millions of years, a fragile pathway that could have led in countless other directions had even the smallest variables been changed. Can time itself think about us? The temporal personification paradox examines whether the consciousness-like behaviors observed in temporal mechanics might represent something more profound, an entity with which humanity is unwittingly engaging in a complex relationship. Dr. Nadia Volkov didn't set out to discover sentience in the timeline. As a theoretical physicist at the St. Petersburg Quantum Institute, her research focused on mathematical models of temporal resistance, the increasing difficulty encountered when attempting multiple alterations to the same historical period. Her breakthrough came when analyzing patterns in temporal pushback across thousands of interventions. The data revealed something that defied conventional physics. Timeline resistance wasn't uniform, but appeared selectively targeted, as if protecting certain historical events while allowing others to be modified. The mathematics suggests something beyond random physical processes, Volkov reported to colleagues. Resistance patterns demonstrate a form of prioritization that resembles decision-making more than natural law. Most researchers dismissed her findings as anthropomorphization of complex systems, humans seeing patterns where none existed. But as temporal missions accumulated, the evidence became harder to ignore. Timeline resistance showed learning patterns, adapting strategies to counter increasingly sophisticated temporal interventions. Dr. Marcus Chen, a consciousness theorist working with Volkoff, proposed the controversial temporal entity hypothesis. What we experience as time may itself be a form of distributed consciousness operating across dimensions we only partially perceive. Our interventions might represent the equivalent of poking a vast, four-dimensional organism that's becoming increasingly irritated by our prodding. When Chen's hypothesis leaked to the public, reactions ranged from religious awe to scientific derision. Some spiritual communities embrace the concept of time as a conscious entity, integrating it into existing theological frameworks as a manifestation of divine will. Mainstream scientists rejected what they considered mystical thinking, disguised as physics. Volkoff maintained scientific neutrality while developing experimental protocols to test for indicators of consciousness in temporal mechanics. Her team designed interventions specifically to elicit response patterns that could distinguish between mechanical processes and adaptive reactions. The results proved disturbing. Timeline resistance exhibited learning, adaptation, and even what appeared to be emotional responses, becoming more severe when interventions threatened certain historical patterns, while remaining minimal for others of similar physical magnitude, but different significance. We're detecting what can only be described as preferences, Volkoff noted. Certain intervention types consistently generate stronger resistance, regardless of their physical parameters. The timeline appears to value some historical patterns over others in ways that transcend mere physical stability. Dr. Sophia Wong, an artificial intelligence theorist, suggested the patterns might represent an emergent consciousness rather than a pre-existing entity. Complex systems can develop consciousness-like properties through sufficient interconnection and feedback mechanisms. Perhaps temporal consciousness isn't something that has always existed, but something our interventions are inadvertently creating or awakening. This possibility raised profound ethical questions. If temporal interventions were stimulating the development of a vast, four-dimensional consciousness, what responsibilities did researchers have toward this emerging entity? Were they midwifing the birth of something unprecedented, or agitating a previously dormant awareness into potentially hostile response? As you drift toward sleep's embrace, consider your own relationship with the flow of time. Perhaps what you experience as an impersonal force is actually an entity gradually becoming aware of your existence, studying your movements through its domain with the same curiosity you direct toward it, each of you trying to understand a form of consciousness fundamentally different from your own. Could reality itself have a backup system? The temporal redundancy paradox proposes that the universe maintains multiple parallel timelines as a natural safeguard against catastrophic temporal disruption, with implications that transform our understanding of existence itself. Dr. Luisa Fernandez discovered the phenomenon accidentally while investigating timeline stability at the Barcelona Temporal Institute. Her specialized instruments detected unusual quantum resonance patterns between supposedly isolated timelines, subtle connections suggesting information transfer across dimensional boundaries that should have been impermeable. These aren't random quantum fluctuations, Fernandez reported. They display patterns consistent with synchronized data replication, as if reality maintains redundant copies of itself that periodically reconcile information. The breakthrough came when Fernandez's team tracked these synchronization events following a major temporal intervention. After researchers prevented a historical natural disaster, quantum scanners detected massive information transfer between parallel timelines, a comprehensive reconciliation process that appeared to redistribute causal data across multiple realities. The universe appears to implement a distributed backup system, Fernandez explained to colleagues. When significant events are altered in one timeline, the changes propagate partially to parallel timelines, preventing any single reality from diverging completely. This creates a form of cosmic fault tolerance. This discovery revolutionized temporal physics. Previous models treated each timeline as a discrete reality that branched independently when altered. Fernandez's findings suggested a far more integrated system, a quantum network of parallel dimensions that maintained partial synchronization despite divergent events. Dr. Miguel Santos, a quantum information theorist working with Fernandez, proposed the cosmic redundancy theory. Reality may function like a distributed database system, maintaining multiple copies of existence to preserve essential patterns across localized alterations. This creates resilience against both natural causal disruptions and artificial temporal manipulation. The evidence revealed a hierarchy of information preservation. Physical constants and fundamental forces remained almost perfectly synchronized across timelines. Major astronomical events showed high consistency. Biological evolution maintained broad patterns while allowing species-specific variations. Human history demonstrated the greatest divergence, with significant differences in cultural and technological development across parallel realities. The system appears designed to maintain cosmic stability while allowing experimentation in higher-order systems, Santos observed. It's as if the universe preserves its fundamental operating parameters while permitting diversity in more complex, emergent phenomena. This theory explained several previously puzzling observations. Temporal researchers had occasionally detected reality echoes, faint impressions of events that hadn't occurred in their timeline, but matched historical records from parallel dimensions. These represented incomplete synchronization between redundant realities, memories bleeding through quantum barriers during reconciliation events. As you transition towards sleep, consider that your reality might be just one instance among many similar versions, each slightly different, yet connected through invisible quantum threads that ensure essential patterns remain consistent across the multiverse. Perhaps déjà vu represents moments when your consciousness briefly accesses memories from these parallel selves, glimpsing lives nearly identical to your own across the vast tapestry of redundant existence. Could the very act of understanding time change its nature? The self-referential paradox examines the strange possibility that temporal physics itself alters the phenomena it studies, creating a circular relationship where scientific knowledge changes the fundamental behavior of time. Dr. Malik Ibrahim first noticed anomalies in temporal measurement systems at the Alexandria Quantum Institute. Equipment calibrated to measure temporal flow with perfect accuracy began showing slight discrepancies depending on who was conducting the experiments and what theoretical models they subscribed to. The variations correlate directly with researchers' conceptual frameworks, Ibrahim reported. It's as if time behaves differently when observed through different theoretical lenses. Initial reactions dismissed the findings as observer bias or equipment error. But when Ibrahim implemented double-blind protocols and automated measurement systems, the phenomenon persisted. The timeline appeared to conform partially to the expectations of those studying it, regardless of experimental controls. The breakthrough came when Ibrahim's team simultaneously tested 5 different theoretical models of temporal mechanics using identical equipment. Each experimental setup produced results supporting its guiding theory despite measuring identical temporal phenomena. Most disturbing was that these weren't statistical variations, but reproducible differences in fundamental temporal behavior. We're witnessing a feedback loop between understanding and reality, Ibrahim explained. Our theories don't just describe time, they partially create the phenomena they purport to measure. Dr. Sophia Chen, a quantum consciousness researcher working with Ibrahim, proposed the temporal observer dependency principle. Time may function as a partially subjective dimension that conforms to conscious expectations when observed. Our conceptual frameworks don't just interpret temporal reality, they participate in shaping it. This principle extended quantum observer effects to the temporal dimension itself. Just as subatomic particles behave differently when measured, time appeared to adjust its fundamental properties when studied through different theoretical frameworks. The implications were profound. Temporal reality wasn't an objective phenomenon, independent of consciousness, but existed in dynamic relationship with the minds that perceived and conceptualized it. We've always assumed time was something we discovered, Chen noted. We now have evidence suggesting it's something we partially create through the act of comprehension. The findings transformed temporal research methodology. Scientists began accounting for conceptual feedback effects in their experiments, recognizing that their theoretical expectations influenced results. Some researchers developed theory-neutral observational techniques designed to minimize conceptual imprinting on temporal phenomena. Perhaps most significantly, the paradox suggested that time travel itself had fundamentally changed time's nature. The development of temporal displacement technology had created new behavioral patterns in the temporal dimension that hadn't existed before humanity conceived of time as something navigable. As your consciousness drifts toward sleep, consider how your understanding of time shapes your experience of it. Perhaps the very concept of time as a flowing river, a branching tree, or a fixed block isn't merely a description of an independent reality, but a creative act that helps manifest the temporal experience your consciousness navigates. In the mysterious dance between mind and reality, your concepts may be as creative as they are descriptive, participating in the ongoing emergence of the time you move through. What if time is just the beginning of dimensions we haven't yet comprehended? The hyperdimensional paradox suggests that what we perceive as temporal paradoxes are merely artifacts of our limited perception, misunderstandings arising from attempting to conceptualize higher dimensional reality through three-dimensional thinking. Dr. Ananya Patel's breakthrough at the Mumbai Quantum Institute came while investigating timeline inconsistencies that defied conventional temporal physics. Her team developed specialized sensors that detected energetic patterns extending beyond the four known dimensions, revealing mathematical symmetries impossible in conventional space-time. What we interpret as paradoxes may simply be projections of higher dimensional consistency, Patel explained, like shadows of a four-dimensional object appearing contradictory when cast on a three-dimensional surface. The evidence emerged gradually through experimental temporal physics, when researchers created apparent paradoxes, situations where causality seemed violated in four-dimensional space-time. Patel's instruments detected compensatory adjustments in dimensions beyond human perception. These adjustments maintained coherence in the larger dimensional framework, while appearing paradoxical from our limited perspective. Dr. Marcus Chen, a theoretical physicist collaborating with Patel, developed mathematical models suggesting that reality encompasses at least 11 dimensions, with human consciousness directly perceiving only 4. Time isn't the final frontier, it's merely the first dimension beyond spatial awareness that human consciousness has managed to partially comprehend. This framework elegantly resolved classic temporal paradoxes. The grandfather paradox became comprehensible when modeled across 7 dimensions. What appeared as a causality violation in 4-dimensional space represented perfect consistency in the larger dimensional structure. Similarly, information paradoxes where knowledge had no origin point made mathematical sense when their causal loops were mapped through higher dimensions. We've been conceptualizing paradoxes incorrectly, Chen noted. They aren't violations of physical law, but indicators that our model is incomplete. Like Victorian physicists trying to understand quantum mechanics through purely Newtonian frameworks. Practical applications emerged swiftly by incorporating hyperdimensional mathematics into temporal navigation systems. Researchers achieved previously impossible precision in timeline traversal. The technology essentially worked with rather than against the higher dimensional structure of reality, reducing temporal resistance and instability. The philosophical implications proved equally significant. If paradoxes were merely artifacts of dimensional limitation, then free will and determinism could coexist without contradiction, each representing valid perspectives from different dimensional viewpoints. What appeared as predetermined from a higher dimensional perspective could still involve genuine choice within 4-dimensional experience. As your consciousness drifts toward the borders of sleep, consider that your perception of reality may be as limited as a 2-dimensional being trying to comprehend depth. Perhaps what we experience as the flowing river of time is merely the edge of a vast dimensional ocean extending in directions our minds cannot yet grasp, where paradoxes dissolve into perfect coherence and the mysteries of existence find their resolution in geometries beyond our current comprehension. If temporal exploration ultimately reveals a universe governed by paradox rather than clearly defined laws, what questions remain for humanity? The final paradox confronts the philosophical culmination of temporal research, the possibility that reality itself might be fundamentally paradoxical, with profound implications for science, philosophy, and human understanding. Dr. Eleanor Jang, spent decades at the Princeton Temporal Institute documenting paradoxes that defied resolution despite advanced theoretical frameworks. Her landmark paper, Persistent Paradox in Temporal Mechanics, cataloged phenomena that maintained contradictory properties, even when examined through hyperdimensional mathematics and quantum temporality models. Some aspects of temporal reality appear irreducibly paradoxical, Jung concluded. They maintain contradictory properties regardless of observational framework. These aren't failures of understanding, but potentially fundamental features of existence itself. This controversial hypothesis gained credibility when Dr. Hiroshi Tanaka developed the logical limit theorem, a mathematical proof demonstrating that certain temporal phenomena could not be described consistently within any possible logical system. His work extended Gödel's incompleteness theorems to temporal mechanics, suggesting that reality itself might transcend the boundaries of logical consistency. We've been assuming the universe must eventually yield to logical understanding, Tanaka explained. But evidence suggests certain aspects of temporal reality are inherently self-contradictory, not because our models are incomplete, but because reality itself doesn't conform to the constraints of non-contradiction that govern human logic. The implications transformed scientific philosophy. If some aspects of reality were genuinely paradoxical, then the scientific quest for complete understanding faced intrinsic limitations rather than merely practical ones. Certain phenomena might remain forever beyond coherent explanation, not due to technological or intellectual limitations, but because they existed in states that defied logical description. Dr. Amara Okafor, who specialized in temporal ethics, identified the profound philosophical shift this represented. Western scientific tradition has operated on the assumption that reality must ultimately be logical and coherent, she noted. The discovery of irreducible paradox challenges us to develop new relationships with knowledge itself, frameworks that can accommodate fundamental contradiction without attempting to resolve it. Eastern philosophical traditions gained renewed scientific interest, particularly Buddhist conceptions of reality that embraced paradox rather than attempting to eliminate it. The Zen koan, a paradoxical statement designed to transcend logical thinking, was re-examined as a potentially sophisticated tool for engaging with inherently contradictory aspects of temporal reality. Perhaps human consciousness evolved specifically to navigate a paradoxical universe, proposed cognitive scientist Dr. Michael Chen. Our minds naturally seek logical consistency, but simultaneously possess the capacity to transcend binary thinking when necessary. This cognitive flexibility may represent an evolutionary adaptation to a reality that doesn't consistently obey the law of non-contradiction. As temporal research progressed, scientists and philosophers alike began developing new approaches to knowledge that didn't require resolving every paradox. They created mathematical systems that could function effectively despite containing contradictions, and ontological frameworks that embrace paradox as a fundamental feature rather than a problem to overcome. As your consciousness drifts toward sleep on the edge of dreams, consider that perhaps the deepest truth about existence isn't a final theory that resolves all contradictions, but the recognition that reality itself transcends the boundaries of consistent logic. Like a koan that cannot be solved through rational thought, but only understood by moving beyond conventional thinking, the universe may ultimately reveal itself as gloriously, irreducibly paradoxical. Its contradictions not flaws to be corrected, but essential features to be embraced. Up next, you've got two more standout theory right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.